You're 17 minutes late. The trial shift is over.
I understand. I'll probably need this somewhere else.
At 10:17 on a bitter February morning, Barbara Garcia stood outside the back door of Bennett's table with snow packed into her hair and blood warming the inside of her left shoe. She had walked 6 miles through a Milwaukee storm for one chance to work. "You're 17 minutes late," Richard Lawson said, barely looking at her. "The trial shift is over." Barbara lowered her eyes, not in defeat, but to hide how badly her legs were shaking. She reached into her coat for the folded apron she had been asked to bring back. Then restaurant owner Thomas Bennett stepped into the hallway. His gaze fell on the 3 red stitches across Barbara's torn heel. The tasting spoon slipped from his hand. "Before we continue, tell us what country you're watching from and your local time. And subscribe so you don't miss what happened next." At 4:46 that morning, Barbara Garcia woke before the alarm ever had a chance to ring. For a few quiet seconds, she lay perfectly still beneath a thin blanket, listening to the apartment breathe around her. The old radiator hissed, coughed, then rattled against the wall as though arguing with the winter outside. Wind slipped through the worn weather stripping around the bedroom window, carrying a faint whistle that never seemed to disappear during February in Milwaukee. She closed her eyes for one more heartbeat, silently counting everything she needed to accomplish before 10 o'clock. Get Sophia ready, find breakfast, catch the bus, arrive at Bennett's table before the interview. Smile. Don't look desperate. She sat up carefully so the mattress wouldn't creak. The apartment had only 2 small bedrooms, and every sound traveled through the thin walls. She didn't want Sophia waking before she had time to make breakfast. Barbara pulled on a faded gray sweatshirt and padded into the kitchen wearing thick socks. The linoleum floor felt like ice. She opened the refrigerator, half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, a small container of plain yogurt, half an onion, a stick of butter wrapped in paper. Nothing else. She stared for a moment before opening the freezer. A nearly empty bag of frozen peas. That was all. She smiled anyway. "Enough," she whispered. It had to be enough. She filled a small saucepan with water, poured in the last of the rolled oats from a paper container, then sprinkled cinnamon over the top. The warm smell spread through the apartment almost immediately. People often said cinnamon made a house smell rich. Barbara liked pretending that was true. While the oatmeal simmered, she reached for her phone. The banking app loaded slowly. Available balance, $11.43. She inhaled deeply. She had checked it before going to bed. It hadn't changed. There was no miracle overnight. No forgotten deposit. No unexpected refund. Just $11.43. She opened the Notes app where she kept every expense. Rent balance $287. Electric bill due next week. Bus card nearly empty. Prescription copay for Sophia's inhaler. Barbara rubbed her forehead. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was afraid of running out of chances to work. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered immediately. "Barbara Garcia." "Yes, this is Amanda from Bennett's table. Just confirming your kitchen trial today at 10 sharp. Please arrive a little early so we can get you changed. I'll be there. We're looking forward to meeting you. So am I." The call ended. Barbara held the phone against her chest. That sentence echoed in her mind. "I'll be there." It wasn't a promise to the restaurant. It was a promise to herself. She divided the oatmeal into 2 bowls. One received almost all the yogurt. The other received only a spoonful. She carried the fuller bowl into Sophia's room. "Sweetheart." Sophia blinked awake. "Morning already." "It is." The little girl stretched before smiling sleepily. "Did it snow?" Barbara pulled back the curtain. The world outside had disappeared beneath fresh white snow. "It snowed a lot." Sophia climbed from bed and pressed both hands against the cold window. "It looks like somebody covered the whole city with powdered sugar." Barbara laughed quietly. "I like that better than hearing the weather report." Sophia turned around. "You made cinnamon oatmeal. I know it's your favorite." Sophia took a bite before looking suspiciously at her mother. "Aren't you eating?" "I already had some while I was cooking." It was an old lie. Barbara had become almost good at saying it. But Sophia wasn't 6 anymore, she was 9, old enough to notice the untouched spoon beside the second bowl. "You always eat slower than me." "I wasn't hungry." Sophia studied her for several seconds. Then, without saying a word, she quietly pushed half of her oatmeal into Barbara's bowl. Barbara immediately shook her head. "No." "Yes, you need breakfast. So do you." Barbara looked away. She hated that poverty had taught her daughter to negotiate with food instead of simply enjoying it. Finally, she accepted 2 small spoonfuls, only enough to make Sophia smile. After breakfast, Barbara packed Sophia's lunch: half a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, a handwritten note folded into a tiny square. The notes had become a tradition. Sometimes they contained jokes, sometimes encouragement, sometimes just one sentence. Today's read: "You are always stronger than you think." While Sophia brushed her teeth, Barbara opened the closet beside the front door. Her interview clothes hung carefully on a wire hanger inside a dry-cleaning bag she had kept for years. Black kitchen pants, a plain white shirt, dark sweater. Everything had been washed twice the night before. She bent down to polish her work shoes with a damp cloth. Then she stopped. The heel of the left shoe had separated almost completely. She sighed. "Not today." She searched every drawer for glue. Nothing, tape, nothing. Sophia appeared beside her carrying a tiny plastic sewing box. "I can fix it," Barbara smiled. "Baby, that's leather. So, you've only sewn stuffed animals. They're harder." Barbara laughed despite herself. Sophia sat cross-legged on the floor. Inside the sewing kit were only 3 colors of thread: blue, white, red. The black spool was empty. "I'll use red. It'll show. It'll hold." Barbara watched her daughter concentrate with surprising seriousness. Her tongue rested between her lips the way it always did when she focused. The first stitch came out crooked. The second was tighter. The third finally pulled the heel back into place. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't invisible. But it was strong. Sophia held the shoe proudly. "There." Barbara examined the bright red stitches. "They're kind of beautiful. They're brave. Brave. They're not trying to hide." Barbara smiled. "You always surprise me." Sophia shrugged. "I think shoes remember every road." Barbara paused. "What do you mean?" "They know where people keep trying." Barbara stared at the little red stitches. Somehow, they suddenly seemed much more important than thread. She slipped the shoes on carefully. They felt tight. The leather pinched her heel, but they would survive one more day. Hopefully. At 6:35, they left the apartment together. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and someone's coffee brewing downstairs. Outside, the cold hit immediately. Barbara pulled Sophia's scarf higher over her face. Across the parking lot, Mrs. Helen Brooks stood beside her aging sedan with the hood raised. She looked up apologetically. "It won't start." Barbara's heart sank. Helen usually drove Sophia to school whenever Barbara had early interviews. "I'm so sorry. It's not your fault." Before Barbara could decide what to do, Sophia's school sent a notification. Due to severe weather, opening delayed by 2 hours. Barbara exhaled slowly. At least they had time. Helen waved them inside her apartment. "You leave Sophia with me." "I hate asking." "You didn't. I still feel like I did." Helen smiled gently. Barbara, needing someone once in a while isn't the same as depending on everyone. Barbara looked at Sophia. I'll be back as soon as I can. You'll get the job, Sophia said. You sound very sure. I am. Barbara kissed her forehead. Then she walked toward the nearest bus stop. The snow had grown heavier. She checked the digital display. Route delayed. 2 minutes later, the message disappeared. New message. Service suspended due to hazardous road conditions. She refreshed it. Same message. Another route. Canceled, another, canceled. Barbara opened a rideshare app. Estimated fare $38.70. She almost laughed. It was more than 3 times the money she had left. She looked at the time. 7:03. Then at the map. 6 miles. She calculated automatically. If she walked quickly, if she didn't stop, if the sidewalks weren't completely blocked. Maybe. Just maybe. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, adjusted her backpack, pulled her coat tighter, looked once toward Helen's apartment window. Sophia stood behind the curtain with one hand pressed against the glass. Barbara smiled and raised her hand. Then she turned towards downtown. One step, then another. Fresh snow immediately covered the footprints behind her, but the bright red stitches on the heel of her shoe held together as she disappeared into the white morning. By 7:08 that morning, Barbara Garcia had already accepted one simple truth. No one was coming to rescue her. She adjusted the straps of her faded backpack, zipped her coat all the way to her chin, and stepped into the snow-covered sidewalk that stretched toward downtown Milwaukee. 6 miles. On a pleasant spring morning, it would have been an exhausting walk. On a February day buried beneath fresh snow, it felt almost impossible. The wind came first. It rushed between the apartment buildings like water through a narrow canyon, stealing the warmth from her face before she'd even reached the first intersection. Barbara tucked her chin lower. Just keep moving, she whispered. The sidewalks had only been partially cleared. Each step sank several inches into loose snow before finding frozen concrete underneath. The effort doubled with every block. She passed a small laundromat whose windows glowed with warm yellow light. Inside, a father folded children's clothes while 2 little girls chased each other between rolling laundry baskets. For a brief second, Barbara imagined stopping. Just 5 minutes. Just enough to warm her hands. Then she looked at the clock on her phone. 7:16. She couldn't afford warmth. She couldn't afford delay. She kept walking. Every few minutes, she silently counted her breathing. 20 steps. Breathe. 20 more. Breathe again. It was an old habit from the years she had worked in a school cafeteria. During busy lunch periods, she had learned that breaking impossible jobs into tiny pieces made them survivable. Don't think about 6 miles. Think about 1 block, then another. At the next corner, a city snowplow thundered past, spraying a wall of slushy ice across the sidewalk. Barbara turned too late. Dirty snow struck her coat, soaked her pant leg, and splashed directly into the opening above her left shoe. She gasped. The freezing water reached her sock instantly. Within seconds, her left foot felt as though it had disappeared beneath a sheet of ice. She stopped beneath a bus shelter and removed the shoe. The bright red stitches Sophia had sewn only an hour earlier were still holding. Barbara smiled despite herself. They're stronger than they look. She removed a folded paper napkin from her pocket, tucked it beneath her heel to reduce the rubbing, and pulled the shoe back on. It hurt immediately. Good. Pain meant she could still feel her foot. She resumed walking. At 7:42, she reached a convenience store. The smell hit her before the automatic doors opened for another customer. Fresh coffee, breakfast sandwiches, bacon, warm bread. Her stomach tightened painfully. She hadn't eaten more than 2 spoonfuls of oatmeal. For a moment, she stood outside watching people hurry in and out carrying steaming cups. A handwritten sign advertised large coffee, $1.99. She opened her banking app again. $11.43. The number hadn't changed. She quietly locked the phone. $2 could become Sophia's medicine. Coffee couldn't. She turned away before the smell convinced her otherwise. A few blocks later, her phone vibrated. Helen Brooks. Barbara answered immediately. "How's my girl?" "She's coloring." Barbara smiled. "Is she behaving?" "She's trying to convince me pancakes count as vegetables." Barbara laughed for the first time that morning. "That sounds like Sophia." Helen's voice softened. "Barbara." "Yes. You don't have to prove anything by walking too fast." "I know." "No." Helen paused. "I don't think you do." Barbara looked at the endless sidewalk ahead. "If I don't get this job—" "You don't know that yet. I need this one." "I know." Barbara thanked her and ended the call before her voice could betray how frightened she really was. By 8:03, the pain in her left heel had become sharp enough to change the way she walked. She shifted more weight onto her right foot. Her shoulders tightened. Her lower back began to ache. Still, she refused to stop. At another intersection, she noticed movement inside an abandoned bus shelter. An older man sat wrapped in a thin army blanket. His gray beard carried tiny crystals of frozen breath. A cardboard sign leaned beside him. Not asking for money, just hungry. Barbara slowed. She knew that look. Not desperation, embarrassment. The man tried to avoid eye contact. He stared at the ground as though pretending not to exist. Barbara reached into her backpack. Her lunch, 1 egg sandwich, 1 apple. That was supposed to keep her going until late afternoon. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to help, because she honestly didn't know whether she could afford to. The man noticed the sandwich. Immediately he looked away. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wasn't asking." Barbara walked closer. "My name's Barbara." He looked surprised. "Samuel." She sat beside him for just a moment, despite the cold. "Have you eaten today?" He smiled weakly. "I'll be all right." People almost never answered that question honestly. Barbara unwrapped the sandwich, carefully broke it into 2 equal halves. She handed 1 piece to Samuel. "You need this more." "So do you," she smiled. "Then we'll both eat." Samuel accepted it with trembling hands. He stared at the sandwich for several seconds before taking the first bite. He closed his eyes. "You have no idea what this means." Barbara shook her head. "I think I do." Samuel studied her face. "You headed to work?" "Trying." He looked down at her shoes. The red stitches caught his attention. "You've walked a long way already." "Not far enough." "You'll be late." "I know." "So, why stop for me?" Barbara looked out toward the snowy street. "My daughter says shoes remember every road." Samuel frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "I don't think she'd want mine remembering that I walked past someone who was hungry." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he quietly nodded. "I hope whoever you're walking to deserves you." Barbara smiled politely. "I hope so too." She stood, brushed the snow from her coat, continued south. The sandwich in her stomach wasn't enough to satisfy her hunger anymore. But somehow it was enough. At 8:41, she approached a busy intersection near a grocery store. A young mother struggled to push a stroller through deep snow while holding the hand of a little boy wearing oversized boots. The child slipped. His knees struck the icy sidewalk. He burst into tears. Several pedestrians glanced over. None stopped. Everyone seemed too cold, Too busy, too late for something. Barbara immediately hurried toward to them. "You okay?" The mother looked exhausted. "I'm trying." The little boy's mitten had come off during the fall. His fingers were turning bright red. Barbara knelt despite the snow soaking through her pants. "It's all right, buddy." She brushed ice away from his knees. The skin beneath was scraped, but not deeply cut. From her backpack, she removed the small packet of tissues she always carried. She wiped away the blood. Then she wrapped her own scarf loosely around the child's neck. "You'll freeze without this," the mother protested. Barbara smiled. "I'll keep walking." The woman looked ready to cry. "I can't pay you." "I'm not selling kindness." The mother whispered thank you several times before continuing towards the clinic across the street. Barbara watched them disappear. Then she checked the time. 8:52. She had lost nearly 15 precious minutes. Her chest tightened. Every delay pushed the interview further away. She started walking faster. The wind seemed even colder now without her scarf. Her ears stung. Her cheeks burned. The wet sock inside her left shoe rubbed against the back of her heel until each step felt like dragging exposed skin across broken glass. Still, the 3 little red stitches refused to give way. Barbara looked down once. "Good job, Soph." Then she smiled. Far ahead, barely visible through the blowing snow, a weathered wooden sign emerged between white curtains of ice. Bennett's table. She could finally see it. Still, nearly a mile away. She looked at the time. 9:47. If nothing else slowed her down. If she ignored the pain. If the sidewalks stayed clear. She might still make it. Barbara inhaled deeply. Then, just as hope began to return, the roar of a delivery truck echoed behind her. Before she could step aside, the truck plowed through a stretch of dirty roadside slush. A wave of icy gray water exploded over her from shoulder to boots. Her white interview shirt beneath the coat instantly became soaked. She closed her eyes. For one brief second, she wanted to sit down in the snow, just for a minute. Just long enough to stop pretending she wasn't exhausted. Instead, she wiped her face with frozen fingers, adjusted her backpack once more, and kept walking toward the restaurant whose sign grew clearer with every painful step. By the time Barbara Garcia reached the service alley behind Bennett's table, the snow had begun to ease. Not because the storm was ending, because she had walked far enough into downtown that the tall brick buildings broke the wind. Her phone read 10:17 a.m., 17 minutes late. Barbara stopped beneath the metal awning outside the rear kitchen entrance. Her lungs burned with every breath. Snow clung to the ends of her dark hair, now damp and heavy against her shoulders. Her coat looked 2 shades darker from melted slush, and the cuffs of her pants were stiff with frozen water. She leaned one hand against the brick wall. Not to rest, just to steady herself before walking inside. "You've already come this far," she whispered. "Finish it standing." She pulled a folded apron from her backpack. The email from Bennett's table had instructed applicants to bring a plain black apron for the kitchen trial. Barbara had washed hers twice the night before and pressed it carefully beneath a stack of books because she no longer owned an iron. Now the apron was damp around the edges despite being wrapped inside a grocery bag. She smoothed it anyway. Appearances still mattered. Even when life refused to cooperate. Barbara opened the heavy steel door. Warm air rushed toward her, carrying the unmistakable sense of roasted garlic, fresh bread, simmering stock, grilled onions, and butter. For a single breathtaking moment, she simply stood there. The warmth hurt. After hours in freezing temperatures, feeling returned to her fingers all at once like hundreds of tiny needles pressing beneath her skin. Voices echoed through the kitchen. "Need 2 more salmon. Soup's running low. Watch behind." Metal pans clattered. Knives struck cutting boards with practiced rhythm. Steam curled upward from enormous pots. It was organized chaos, the kind Barbara understood better than almost anywhere else. She took one careful step inside. A tall man wearing a Navy manager's shirt looked up from a clipboard. Richard Lawson. He glanced first at Barbara, then at the wall clock. His expression never changed. "You, Barbara Garcia?" "Yes, sir." He looked back at the clock again. "It's 10:17. I'm sorry. Our trial begins at 10. "I know. We've already assigned today's station." Barbara swallowed. The buses stopped running because of the storm. Richard's face remained perfectly calm. "We all dealt with the same weather." "I walked. So did some of our staff." Barbara opened her mouth, then stopped. There was no point arguing. Richard wasn't asking questions because he wanted answers. He had already made his decision. "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner," she said quietly. "I believe you intended to." The sentence almost sounded kind. Then he continued. "But intention doesn't prep vegetables or serve lunch." Barbara lowered her eyes briefly, not out of shame, to gather herself. "I understand." Richard nodded toward the apron in her hands. "You can leave that with me." Barbara looked down at the neatly folded fabric. She had imagined tying it around her waist all morning. Instead, she folded it once more, carefully, as though treating the moment gently might somehow make it hurt less. "I'd rather take it home." Richard looked mildly surprised. "I washed it." She smiled faintly. "I'll probably need it somewhere else." For the first time, something resembling respect flickered across his face. Only for an instant. "I'm sorry." "So am I." Barbara turned toward the door. Her legs felt strangely heavier than they had during the 6-mile walk. Walking through snow had been exhausting. Walking away from hope weighed even more. Near the dishwashing station, a young employee had paused while stacking clean plates. He couldn't have been older than 21. His name tag read Jordan. He watched Barbara without saying anything. His eyes moved from her soaked coat to the slush dripping from her pant legs. Then they stopped at the dark stain spreading slowly across the heel of her left shoe. Blood. Barbara noticed his gaze. Instinctively, she shifted her foot behind the other, not because she was embarrassed, because she didn't want anyone worrying about her. Richard reached for the door. "I'll walk you out." Before either of them moved, another voice echoed from the hallway leading toward the office. "Richard?" The entire kitchen seemed to pause. Not completely, just enough that conversations became quieter. A man in his early 50s emerged carrying a silver-tasting spoon. Thomas Bennett, the owner. His chef's coat was spotless despite the lunch rush. He looked tired in a way expensive suits and polished shoes could never hide. The kind of tiredness that came from responsibility instead of lack of sleep. Thomas was reading something on a tablet as he walked. "Did the seafood order finally—" He stopped speaking. Richard answered. "Interview applicant. Running late. 17 minutes. Thomas nodded absently. "Reschedule her. I'm sending her home." Thomas looked up. His eyes met Barbara's for less than a second. Then they dropped automatically toward the wet floor beneath her. Toward the snow melting around her boots. Toward the shoes. Everything else disappeared. The conversations. The kitchen noise. The sizzling grills. The ringing service bell. Thomas stared at the heel of Barbara's left shoe. 3 uneven red stitches crossed the torn leather. His fingers loosened. The silver tasting spoon slipped from his hand. It struck the tile floor with a sharp metallic clang that echoed through the kitchen. Nobody moved. Thomas took one slow step forward. His face had turned noticeably pale. Richard frowned. "Thomas." No answer. Another step. His eyes never left the shoe. Barbara instinctively stepped backward. "I'm sorry if—" "Where?" Thomas's voice cracked unexpectedly. "Where did you get those shoes?" Barbara blinked. "I'm sorry." "The shoes?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get them?" Barbara glanced down. "They're just old work shoes." "Answer me." The intensity in his voice startled everyone nearby. Barbara hesitated. "I found them in a church donation room." "What church?" "St. Matthew's Community Center." "How long ago?" "About 8 months." Thomas slowly knelt. Not in front of Barbara, in front of the shoes. Jordan stared in disbelief. Richard looked equally confused. Thomas pointed toward the left heel. "May I?" Barbara instinctively stepped back. "I'm sorry, but—" He immediately looked up. The urgency in his face softened. "I won't damage them." Barbara studied him. Nothing about his expression resembled curiosity. It looked closer to grief. Slowly she nodded. Thomas reached out carefully. His fingertips brushed the edge of the worn leather. Then the bright red thread. His hand began trembling. He closed his eyes for one brief second. "No." He whispered the word almost to himself. His thumb traced the 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3, exactly where they had always been. Barbara frowned. "Is something wrong?" Thomas looked up. "When I was 12, his voice stopped again. He swallowed hard. "I stitched these." Silence filled the kitchen. Richard laughed awkwardly. "Thomas." Thomas ignored him. "My mother caught the heel on a broken freezer hinge." His eyes remained fixed on the shoe. "We couldn't afford another pair." He smiled painfully. "I kept sewing them wrong." Barbara said nothing. Thomas continued. "She let me try anyway." He looked toward the ceiling as though watching another lifetime unfold. "I used red thread because we had no black left." Jordan slowly lowered the tray he had been holding. Even the cooks nearest the grill had stopped pretending not to listen. Thomas looked back at Barbara. "Would you—" His voice softened again. "Would you mind taking off the shoe?" Barbara hesitated. The request felt strange, personal, almost invasive. Yet something in Thomas's expression made refusal seem impossible. She untied the worn lace, carefully slipped the shoe off. The damp sock beneath it carried a faint stain of blood. Jordan quietly turned away, pretending to organize dishes so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. Thomas gently lifted the shoe. He folded back the tongue. Hidden beneath faded fabric nearly invisible after years of wear were faint handwritten initials. E.B. Thomas inhaled sharply. Eleanor Bennett, his mother's name. He closed his eyes. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Barbara finally broke the silence. "I didn't know." "I know. I would have returned them if—" "No." Thomas looked at her. "You've already honored them." Barbara frowned. "I don't understand." Thomas looked at the blood soaking through her sock, then at the melted snow surrounding her feet, then at the damp apron still folded in her hands. "How did you get here?" Barbara answered honestly. "I walked." "From where?" "The north side." "In this storm?" "The buses stopped." "How far?" She hesitated. "About 6 miles." Thomas lowered his head. His mother had once walked nearly the same distance through winter mornings to wait tables before sunrise. Suddenly, the shoe no longer felt like an old piece of leather. It felt like memory, like regret. Like every morning, he had been too young to understand why his mother came home limping but still smiled before asking about his homework. Richard cleared his throat. "Thomas, lunch service is already behind." Thomas slowly stood. His voice was calm again, but something inside it had changed. "Richard?" "Yes?" "Prepare Station 4. Richard stared. The interview ended. Thomas looked directly at Barbara. No, it never truly began. Barbara shook her head gently. I don't want special treatment. Thomas answered without hesitation. This isn't special treatment. He picked up her folded apron from the counter and handed it back to her. This is returning the opportunity you earned before you ever reached this building. Barbara looked at the apron, then at the exhausted faces around the kitchen, then back at Thomas. I still expect to be judged by my work. A faint smile appeared on his face for the first time. So do I. Jordan stepped forward carrying a clean kitchen towel. You can use this to dry off. Barbara accepted it quietly. Thank you. As she tied the black apron around her waist, the pain in her blistered heel returned with every heartbeat. She slipped her foot back into the old shoe one last time. The 3 red stitches held firm. Outside, fresh snow continued falling over Milwaukee. Inside Bennett's table. A story that had begun decades earlier with one exhausted waitress and one frightened little boy was about to begin again. Barbara had barely finished tying her apron when Richard Lawson placed a cutting board in front of her with enough force to make the knives rattle. If you're going to work, he said without looking at her, then work. He pointed toward 3 overflowing crates. 30 pounds of onions, 20 pounds of carrots, celery, potatoes, mirepoix for tomorrow. Then move to cold prep. After that, you'll assist soup. Don't ask anyone to slow down for you. Barbara nodded once. I understand. Richard turned to leave before adding one last sentence. And don't expect anyone to rescue you because the owner got emotional. The words stung. Not because they were cruel, because Barbara had spent years proving exactly the same thing to herself. She didn't want rescue. She wanted a fair chance. Jordan quietly walked over carrying a chef's knife wrapped in a towel. This one's sharper, Barbara smiled. Thank you. My grandma always said a dull knife is more dangerous. My father used to say that too. Jordan noticed the way Barbara tested the knife not by waving it dramatically, but by gently slicing through a sheet of parchment paper resting on the table. One smooth motion. No hesitation. His eyebrows lifted. You've done this before. Barbara simply smiled, a few thousand times. Without wasting another second, she began working. The rhythm returned almost immediately. Peel, trim, slice, rotate, repeat. Each onion became identical to the last. Each carrot matched the previous cut. The movements were calm, economical, almost graceful. She never hurried. She simply never wasted motion. Across the kitchen, one of the line cooks glanced over. Who's the new lady? Jordan answered quietly. The one Richard wanted to send home. The cook looked again. She doesn't move like someone who's new. No. She moves like someone who's hungry. Barbara heard the comment. She pretended not to. By 11:05, 3 full containers of vegetables were stacked neatly beside her station. Richard walked over, expecting to find unfinished work. Instead, he inspected the cuts. Every piece nearly identical. No unnecessary waste. He picked up a carrot cube, measured it against another, then another, almost perfectly uniform. He looked at Barbara. You worked institutional kitchens. Barbara nodded. Elementary school cafeteria. How many meals? About 700 a day. Richard's expression barely changed, but internally he adjusted his opinion. School kitchens required speed, consistency, organization. People who survived there usually knew exactly what they were doing. He said nothing. Instead, he pointed toward the soup station. Help, Denise. Barbara moved immediately. Denise Harper, the soup chef, was stirring 2 enormous stock pots simultaneously. Without looking up, she asked, Can you taste? Barbara washed her hands again before reaching for a clean spoon. She sampled the chicken soup first, balanced, warm, comforting. Then the roasted tomato bisque. She frowned. Denise noticed instantly. "What? Did you change tomatoes?" "We had to." Barbara tasted once more. "Needs acidity." Denise folded her arms. "You sure?" Barbara nodded. "The cream is muting everything." Denise squeezed half a lemon into one ladle, stirred and tasted again. Her eyes widened. "There it is." She looked at Barbara with newfound respect. "You've got a good palate." Barbara smiled. "I've ruined enough soups to recognize one." For the first time that morning, Denise laughed. Lunch service exploded at exactly 11:30. Tickets flooded from the printer. Servers rushed through swinging doors. Orders echoed from every direction. 2 chowders. 3 bisques. Need another pot? Barbara stepped naturally into the rhythm. She anticipated instead of reacted. When Denise reached for fresh ladles, they were already waiting. When vegetables ran low, replacements appeared. When empty pans returned, Barbara cleaned and reset them before anyone asked. Jordan watched in amazement. Nobody had trained her. She simply saw what needed doing. Halfway through service, another cook hurried over, carrying a stainless steel pot. "We've got a problem." Denise tasted it. Immediately her face tightened. "Way too salty." She looked toward Richard. "Oh, we'll have to dump it." Barbara took the spoon. She sampled the soup. Not ruined, just overwhelmed. "How much unsalted stock do we have?" Denise blinked. "About 6 quarts. Potatoes in storage. Roasted carrots. Ready?" Barbara spoke quickly but calmly. "Add unsalted stock. Simmer peeled potatoes for 15 minutes. Remove them. Blend roasted carrots into the base. It'll restore balance without thinning the texture." Richard happened to overhear. He crossed his arms. "That's a gamble." Barbara looked directly at him. "So is throwing away 40 servings during lunch." Richard hesitated, then nodded once. "Do it." Everyone moved. Jordan fetched potatoes. Denise adjusted burners. Barbara worked steadily, never raising her voice. 15 minutes later, Denise tasted the soup again. Silence, then another spoonful. She slowly smiled. "You saved it." Barbara shook her head. "We all did." Richard looked at the recovered pot. 40 meals rescued, nearly $200 in ingredients saved. He made no comment, but he quietly crossed something off the clipboard he carried. Near noon, the dining room filled completely. Servers moved faster than ever. One waitress rushed toward the kitchen carrying a plate. "Table 12 says the salad has walnuts." The grill cook frowned. "It shouldn't." Barbara immediately froze. "What dressing?" "The house vinaigrette." Barbara looked toward the prep counter. The bottle beside the vinegar had been switched. Someone had accidentally used walnut oil. Stop." The entire station paused. "That order's for Mrs. Klein." The waitress nodded. "How'd you know?" "I heard her ask if everything was nut-free when she came in." The waitress's eyes widened. Barbara grabbed a fresh bowl. "Remake it." "What if she already took a bite?" "She hasn't." The waitress hurried back. 30 seconds later she returned. "You were right. Mrs. Klein hadn't touched the salad because she was still talking with her husband. The mistake had been caught in time." Denise quietly whispered, "That could have killed somebody." Barbara didn't answer. She simply sanitized the entire station before preparing fresh dressing. Across the kitchen, Thomas Bennett had witnessed everything from the pass. He had said almost nothing all morning. Instead, he watched. Barbara never announced her experience, never reminded people how far she'd walked, never asked for sympathy. She simply worked, exactly the way his mother had. Near 1 o'clock, Jordan noticed Barbara shifting her weight strangely. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "You've been limping." I'll survive. As she turned, a small drop of blood landed near the rubber kitchen mat. Jordan looked down. So, that's why. Barbara quickly wiped the floor with sanitizer. Nobody slips. You need first aid. I need another 20 minutes. Jordan disappeared. A minute later, he returned carrying a first aid kit. Denise looked up. Sit. Barbara hesitated. The orders. I said sit. There was something about Denise's tone that reminded Barbara of older cafeteria workers she'd loved years ago. She obeyed. Jordan carefully helped remove her left shoe. Everyone nearby inhaled sharply. The sock had stuck to the blister. Blood had soaked completely through the heel. Denise frowned. You walked like this. Barbara nodded. It got worse after mile 4. Jordan looked horrified. You didn't tell anyone. Barbara smiled gently. There wasn't much anyone could do. Denise cleaned the wound carefully. This is going to sting. It already does. Jordan laughed despite himself. The tension eased. Richard happened to walk past. He stopped, looked at the injured foot, then at the soaked shoe. For the first time all day, he seemed unable to find anything critical to say. Instead, he quietly handed Barbara a fresh pair of kitchen socks from the employee locker room. No charge. Barbara accepted them. I'll replace them. Richard answered almost automatically. Just don't bleed on my floor. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it wasn't cold either. Barbara understood. Sometimes people changed one sentence at a time. Lunch finally slowed around 2:15. The kitchen breathed again. Employees leaned against counters sipping water. Jordan stretched his aching shoulders. Denise rolled her neck. Barbara removed her apron and carefully folded it. Thomas approached. You've had a long day. Barbara smiled. It's been longer than most, I imagine. He looked toward the soup station. Denise tells me you saved 40 portions. Anyone with enough experience could have. Maybe, he continued. You also prevented an allergy emergency. Barbara shrugged. I noticed something. Thomas nodded slowly. And you never once mentioned walking 6 miles. I didn't come here to tell stories. She looked him directly in the eye. I came here to cook. Thomas was about to respond when Richard appeared carrying a thin manila folder. I think you should see this. Thomas accepted it. The label across the front read Barbara Garcia, Employment Verification. He opened the file. Halfway down the page, one sentence immediately caught his attention. Employment terminated due to cash handling irregularities pending internal investigation. Thomas looked up. Barbara noticed the expression on his face. She had seen it before. Hope interrupted by doubt. And she knew exactly what question was coming next. The kitchen had finally fallen quiet. Only the low hum of the walk-in refrigerator and the rhythmic clicking of the dishwasher remained. The lunch rush was over, and most of the cooks had disappeared into the break room with paper cups of coffee and sore shoulders. Barbara was rinsing her cutting board when Thomas Bennett approached. He didn't carry the employment file openly anymore. Instead, it rested beneath one arm. Barbara, she looked up. Would you step into my office for a moment? She nodded without hesitation. Richard remained where he was, pretending to organize invoices, though it was obvious he intended to hear as much of the conversation as possible. Jordan watched Barbara disappear down the hallway and quietly whispered to Denise, Do you think she's getting hired? Denise didn't answer. She had worked in restaurants long enough to know that kitchens rarely tested people with knives. They tested them with paperwork. Thomas's office overlooked the dining room through a narrow interior window. Shelves lined one wall filled with cookbooks, framed newspaper clippings, and photographs taken over decades. Barbara noticed one photograph immediately. A woman in a waitress uniform stood outside a much smaller version of Bennett's table. She wore a warm smile. On her feet were familiar black shoes. Even from several feet away, Barbara could see the faint line where it had the and dashed across the heel. Thomas followed her gaze. "My mother." Barbara smiled softly. "She looks kind." She was. Zadie set the folder on his desk. "Please sit." Barbara remained standing. "I've been sitting enough today." A faint smile crossed Thomas's face before disappearing. He opened the folder. "I need to ask you about something." "I figured you would." He looked up. "You already know what's in here. I've been carrying it for almost 3 years." Thomas slowly turned the document toward her. Employment terminated due to cash handling irregularities. Pending internal investigation. Failure to follow financial procedures. "I didn't steal anything," Barbara said quietly. Thomas studied her expression. She didn't sound defensive. She sounded tired. "I'd still like to hear the story." Barbara nodded. "Fair enough." She took a slow breath. "I worked evenings at Riverside Grill after the school district reduced cafeteria hours." Thomas listened without interrupting. "Our manager handled tips." She paused. "At first, I thought the numbers just didn't make sense because I wasn't good with bookkeeping." "So you checked." "I checked every night." "What did you find?" Barbara looked toward the office window. "Servers were leaving with less money than they earned." "How much less?" "Sometimes $20. Sometimes 60. One night nearly 100. Thomas folded his hands. "What did you do?" "I asked questions." "And?" "The manager said I couldn't count." Barbara gave a small smile without humor. "So I counted again." She described how she had begun photographing closing reports with permission from another supervisor who assumed everything was routine. The totals didn't match. Cash deposits were consistently smaller than recorded sales. Tips disappeared. Refunds appeared for customers who had never requested them. Thomas asked only one question. "Did you report it?" The owner was out of state. So I emailed him. "What happened?" Barbara laughed quietly. "Nothing. For 2 weeks. Then the manager found out." She remembered the exact morning. She had arrived for work to discover 2 police officers speaking with the owner. Not because anyone had been arrested. Because money was missing again. The manager claimed Barbara had been responsible for closing the register. She hadn't. But the schedule had already been altered. Someone had changed the paperwork. I didn't understand. Barbara stared at the desk. I kept thinking facts would fix everything. Thomas knew that feeling. Sometimes they didn't. The owner offered me a choice. What choice? Resign quietly. Or he'd let the investigation continue. Barbara looked directly at Thomas. "I had $400 in savings. My daughter was 6. I couldn't spend months fighting something I hadn't done. So you resigned. I signed the papers." Thomas remained silent. Barbara continued. "I thought they'd eventually discover the truth. They never called. They never apologized. They just mailed my final paycheck." She smiled sadly. Every application after that became harder. Thomas closed the folder. "Why didn't you sue?" Barbara almost laughed. "With what money?" Silence settled between them. Finally, Thomas asked, "Was there anyone who could have supported your version?" "There were people." "You didn't ask them." "I refused." Thomas frowned. "Why?" Barbara answered without hesitation. "Most of them had children, too." "If they testified and lost their jobs," she shrugged. "I couldn't ask that." Thomas leaned back. "So you carried the blame." "I carried the paperwork," she corrected him gently. "The blame belongs to whoever earned it." Thomas looked toward the photograph of his mother. "Eleanor would have liked you." Barbara smiled politely. "I wish she'd known me without all this." Thomas's eyes lingered on the shoes in the photograph. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "my mother cleaned motel rooms during the day and waited tables here at night." Barbara listened. She never complained where I could hear. "But I heard anyway." He smiled faintly. "I used to think successful people never got tired. What changed? I became one." Barbara looked around the office. "Does it feel like success?" Thomas took longer than expected to answer. "Some days. Most days. No." He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the dining room. "My father died when I was 16. My mother kept this restaurant alive. I promised myself that if I ever owned it, nobody would threaten its future." Barbara nodded. "So rules became important. They became everything." He turned back. "I stopped asking why people struggled. I only asked whether they performed." Barbara didn't criticize him. Instead, she said, "Fear can make good people measure the wrong things." Thomas absorbed the sentence quietly. A knock interrupted them. Richard entered, carrying several invoices. "I need your signature." Thomas accepted them. Richard noticed the closed employment folder. "I assume we're done." Thomas looked at him. "Not yet." Richard hesitated. "I've also prepared the paperwork ending today's trial." Barbara expected it. She had lived this moment before. Thomas didn't sign. Instead, he asked, "Richard, how many portions of soup were saved today?" Richard blinked. 40. "How many dollars in product?" "Approximately 190. "Who prevented an allergy incident?" Richard sighed. "Barbara." "Who reorganized prep without instruction?" "Barbara." "You, who arrived late?" Richard answered immediately. "Barbara." Thomas nodded. "One fact doesn't erase the others." Richard remained silent. Barbara spoke before either man could continue. "If my record is too much risk—" Thomas looked at her. "I haven't finished." She stopped. He walked toward a storage cabinet and opened it. Inside sat several pairs of black, slip-resistant kitchen shoes still in their boxes. He removed one. "Our insurance requires everyone working in the kitchen to wear approved footwear." Barbara looked at the box. "I appreciate it. You'll need these." "I can't accept them." "They're standard issue. I'll pay for them." Thomas smiled slightly. "You really don't make anything easy." "No," Barbara answered honestly. "I've learned that accepting something you didn't earn usually costs more later." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. He found an inventory sheet. "Employee equipment." He wrote her name beside one pair of shoes. Then he wrote payroll deduction $8 per week until paid in full. He slid the paper across the desk. Barbara read it carefully. Only then did she nod. "Thank you." Thomas handed her the new shoes. "They'll protect your feet." She looked down at her old pair. The leather was cracked, the soles nearly smooth. The 3 bright red stitches stood out even more now. Carefully, she placed them inside the empty shoebox. She wasn't ready to throw them away. Not yet. As she tied the new shoes, Thomas said quietly, "Those old ones belong here too." Barbara looked up. "They belong with whoever's walking in them." Thomas smiled. "Fair point." When they returned to the kitchen, Jordan immediately noticed the new footwear. "You staying?" Barbara looked towards Thomas before answering. "I don't know yet." Richard approached, carrying a clipboard. Thomas spoke before he could. "Barbara Garcia will continue on a 2-week paid probation." Richard frowned. "Based on what?" "Based on today's performance." "And the file?" Thomas met his eyes. "The file raises questions." so we'll answer them. Richard looked unconvinced. This restaurant can't survive on instincts. Thomas answered calmly. No, it survives on people. Richard said nothing more. Barbara quietly carried the box containing her old shoes toward the employee lockers. Before placing it inside, she opened the lid one last time. Her fingers touched the worn leather. She smiled as she remembered Sophia sitting cross-legged on the apartment floor, tongue pressed against her lip, while carefully sewing 3 uneven stitches with the last length of red thread they owned. Shoes remember every road, Sophia had whispered. Barbara closed the box gently. Maybe they did, and maybe for the first time in years, those roads were finally leading somewhere new. Barbara Garcia's first official day as a probationary employee began at 4:28 the next morning. The apartment was still dark when she opened her eyes. For one brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then she felt the ache. Her calves throbbed from the 6-mile walk through the storm. The blister on her left heel pulsed beneath its bandage. Her shoulders felt stiff from hours of chopping vegetables, lifting stock pots, and standing over hot burners after arriving half-frozen. She slowly sat up without waking Sophia. The little girl slept curled around the stuffed rabbit she had owned since kindergarten, one small hand resting beneath her cheek. Barbara smiled. No matter how difficult the previous day had been, seeing Sophia sleep safely at home made the pain easier to carry. She quietly dressed in the kitchen. The new non-slip shoes Thomas had issued sat beside the door. Before putting them on, Barbara opened the shoebox containing her old pair. The leather was still damp despite spending the night near the radiator. She gently ran one finger across the 3 crooked red stitches. "They got me there," she whispered. "They did their job." She closed the lid. The old shoes stayed. Not because she planned to wear them again, because some journeys deserve to be remembered. She slipped into the new shoes. They felt strange, too comfortable, too stable. She wasn't used to walking without pain. The thought made her laugh softly. Coffee wasn't an option that morning. She couldn't justify buying it. Instead, she heated water and stirred a spoonful of instant cocoa into 2 mugs. It wasn't rich enough to be hot chocolate. It wasn't bitter enough to be coffee. Somewhere in between. Just enough warmth to begin the day. By the time Sophia wandered into the kitchen rubbing her eyes, breakfast was already waiting. Toast, scrambled eggs, orange slices. Not much, but more than yesterday. Sophia climbed onto the chair. "You got the job." Barbara smiled. "I got 2 weeks. That's still getting the job. It's getting a chance." Sophia grinned. "I knew you would." Barbara reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I need you to help me with something." "What?" "We don't tell people we've solved everything." Sophia looked confused. "We haven't." Barbara nodded. "Exactly." The little girl thought for a moment before smiling. "So, we're celebrating quietly." "That's right." After breakfast, Barbara walked Sophia downstairs. Mrs. Helen Brooks waited in the hallway wearing a thick blue cardigan. She immediately noticed the shoes. "Those are new." Barbara looked down. "They're part of the uniform." Helen smiled knowingly. "They look better than the old ones. They feel different." "Good different." Barbara hesitated. "They make me realize how much the old ones hurt." Helen nodded slowly. "Sometimes we don't notice pain until it finally stops." Barbara carried those words with her all morning. The bus service had resumed overnight. For the first time in days, she rode instead of walking. As the city passed outside the window, she watched people climbing aboard with headphones, briefcases, backpacks, coffee cups. Nobody knew she had walked this entire route yesterday. Nobody needed to. By 6:18, she stepped through the back entrance of Bennett's table. Jordan was already unloading produce. He waved enthusiastically. "You beat Richard." Barbara laughed. "I don't think that's difficult." Jordan leaned closer. "He's been here since 5. "Never mind." Denise arrived carrying 2 large boxes of herbs. "Morning." "Morning." She looked Barbara up and down. "No limp. New shoes. Told you they'd help." Barbara smiled. "They do." The kitchen slowly came alive. Unlike yesterday's frantic interview today, Barbara was simply another employee. No one stopped to watch her. No one whispered. There was comfort in becoming ordinary. Richard entered exactly at 6:30, clipboard in hand. His eyes immediately scanned every station. He stopped beside Barbara. "You're early." "I planned for traffic." "You take the bus?" "Yes." He made a small note on the clipboard. Barbara wondered what he had written. Probably nothing important. Still, she noticed he wasn't looking for reasons to criticize her quite as aggressively as before. That counted for something. The morning passed quickly. Barbara organized prep lists before anyone requested them. She rotated vegetables so older stock would be used first. She labeled containers with larger, clearer handwriting after noticing several cooks squinting to read the previous day's labels. Around 9 o'clock, she quietly approached Denise. "Can I show you something?" Denise nodded. Barbara pointed toward 3 nearly full containers in the refrigerator. "Those herbs won't survive until tomorrow. We'll probably throw them out." "What if we make herb butter today?" Denise considered it. "Freeze it." "Exactly. Less waste," Denise smiled. "I like the way your brain works." By lunch, the herb butter had already been incorporated into several specials. Thomas noticed immediately. "Who came up with this?" Denise pointed toward Barbara. "She hates throwing away food." Thomas looked toward Barbara, who was trimming parsley at another station. He didn't interrupt. He simply smiled to himself. Late that afternoon, Thomas called a short staff meeting. Everyone gathered near the dining room entrance. He held several printed reports. "I'll keep this brief." The employees exchanged curious glances. "Our food waste last week averaged 18%. He lifted another sheet. "Yesterday," he looked toward Barbara. "We finished at 11. Several cooks looked surprised. Thomas continued. "That's the lowest single-day waste percentage we've had in nearly 14 months, Richard added quietly, without reducing quality. Thomas nodded. "Exactly." He looked around the room. "I don't care where good ideas come from. I care whether they work." Barbara lowered her eyes. She wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. Thomas seemed to understand. He moved on. "Let's keep improving." The meeting ended. As everyone returned to work, Jordan nudged Barbara gently. "Nice. It wasn't just me." "I know. But you started it." Barbara smiled without answering. That evening, after the restaurant closed, she remained behind, cleaning her station. Jordan noticed. "You don't have to stay. I'm almost finished." "We've got closing staff." Barbara rinsed another cutting board. "I like leaving things ready." Jordan leaned against the counter. "My mom used to do that." Barbara glanced up. "She cooked." "No. She cleaned offices." He smiled faintly. "She always said tomorrow deserves a clean start." Barbara nodded. "She sounds wise." Jordan laughed. "She also said teenage boys smelled terrible." Barbara laughed harder than she expected. The sound echoed warmly through the nearly empty kitchen. Thomas happened to hear it while walking past. It struck him because it was the first time he'd heard Barbara laugh. Yesterday, she had arrived exhausted. Today, she sounded lighter. Not happy, not yet, but lighter. As Barbara prepared to leave, Thomas approached. "Walking home?" She shook her head. "The bus?" "Good." He hesitated. "I wanted to ask something." Of course. Yesterday. He looked uncomfortable. When you stopped to help Samuel. Barbara seemed surprised. How did you know about that? He came back. Barbara blinked. He did. Thomas nodded. He wanted to thank whoever made the soup. He also told me about the sandwich. Barbara looked away. It wasn't much. It was half your lunch. She shrugged. He needed it. Thomas watched her carefully. You never mentioned it. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I know. They stood in silence for several seconds. Finally, Thomas spoke again. My mother used to carry extra sandwiches in her apron. Barbara looked up. For the staff. For whoever looked hungrier than she did. Barbara smiled softly. She sounds like someone I would have liked. Thomas smiled too. I think she would have insisted you take 2 sandwiches instead of sharing one. Barbara laughed. She probably would have. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Not the violent storm from yesterday, just soft flakes drifting beneath the streetlights. Barbara waited at the bus stop with several other workers finishing late shifts. Across the street, she noticed a woman standing with 2 small children outside a grocery store. The youngest stared longingly at the poster advertising hot chicken soup. The mother gently touched the child's shoulder before leading both children away. Barbara watched them disappear into the evening. Back at the restaurant, she couldn't stop thinking about the image followed her home. It followed her while she tucked Sophia into bed. It followed her while she balanced the checkbook at the kitchen table. The numbers still didn't work, even with the new job, rent, medicine, utilities, groceries. There wasn't enough room for mistakes. Yet something else occupied her thoughts more than unpaid bills. Food. Perfectly good food. Food she had watched being discarded because it couldn't be served tomorrow. She understood health codes. She understood safety, but she also understood hunger. She opened a notebook and began writing. Not recipes, ideas, how to use surplus ingredients, how to preserve leftovers safely, how customers might quietly purchase an extra meal for someone they'd never meet. No photographs, no speeches, no publicity, just dignity. She stopped writing only when she noticed the time. 11:18 p.m. Before closing the notebook, she wrote one sentence across the top of the page. No one should have to choose between dignity and dinner. She closed the cover without realizing that those words and the ideas beneath them would soon challenge everything Thomas Bennett believed a restaurant was meant to be. The notebook stayed in Barbara Garcia's backpack for 3 days. She never mentioned it. Not to Jordan, not to Denise, not even to Sophia. Every evening after work, she added another page. Sometimes it contained numbers. Sometimes rough sketches of storage shelves. Sometimes recipes that could transform vegetables nearing the end of their freshness into soups, casseroles, or savory pies without compromising quality or food safety. One page simply contained a question. How do you feed someone without making them feel pitied? Barbara stared at that sentence for a long time. She knew the answer wasn't free food. She had accepted help before, church food pantries, school backpack programs, neighbors dropping off groceries without asking questions. She had appreciated every act of kindness. But she also remembered how each visit had quietly chipped away at her pride until she learned to smile while pretending she needed less than she actually did. She wanted something different, something that protected dignity as carefully as it protected hunger. Friday evening arrived with another steady snowfall. Business slowed after 7 o'clock. Only a handful of customers remained in the dining room. Jordan was wiping down stainless steel counters when Denise carried a deep stock pot toward the walk-in refrigerator. She stopped halfway. We've got nearly 12 quarts left. Richard looked over from the office doorway. Dump it. Barbara instinctively looked up. The soup was still steaming. It had been prepared that morning. Stored correctly, perfectly safe. Denise hesitated. Seems like a waste. Richard shrugged. We can't serve it tomorrow. Health policy. Barbara remained silent. She understood the regulation. Prepared soup held overnight for table service could become a liability unless processed under specific procedures the restaurant didn't currently use. The rule existed for a reason. But watching perfectly good food disappear into a disposal sink still hurt. Richard noticed her expression. You've got something to say, Barbara answered carefully. I have a question. Go ahead. What if customers bought it before closing? Richard frowned. They're not. What if they knew they could? They don't. Barbara stepped closer. What if? She chose her words slowly. We offered a closing hour soup special. Richard crossed his arms. We're not a discount diner. I'm not talking about lowering standards. I'm talking about using food we're already preparing. Denise looked interested. Jordan quietly stopped cleaning to listen. Barbara continued. 1 soup. 1 bread roll. Limited quantity. Only during the last 30 minutes before closing. Richard shook his head. It changes the brand. Barbara didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her backpack. I've been working on something. She handed him the notebook. Richard flipped through the pages. His eyebrows slowly rose. Everything had been calculated. Ingredient costs, labor, packaging, food safety procedures, temperature logs, projected waste reduction, possible revenue. There were even notes explaining which recipes improved after resting several hours and which absolutely should never be reused. Denise leaned over his shoulder. You did all this. Barbara nodded. After work, Thomas entered from the dining room before Richard answered. What's going on? Richard handed him the notebook without comment. Thomas read silently. The kitchen grew unusually quiet. Several employees pretended to keep working while watching him from the corners of their eyes. Finally, he looked up. You've spent a lot of time on this. Barbara nodded. I know it's probably not practical. Thomas turned another page. These numbers, I estimated conservatively. You included refrigeration costs. I didn't want to ignore them. You even calculated employee cleanup time. Barbara smiled faintly. I've learned that ideas only matter if someone can actually afford them. Thomas closed the notebook. I appreciate the work. Barbara waited. But Bennett's table isn't built around discounts. Barbara had expected that answer. She nodded respectfully. I understand, Thomas continued. We've spent decades building a reputation. If people begin associating us with cheap, end-of-day food... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Barbara slipped the notebook back into her bag. I wasn't trying to make the restaurant cheaper. I know. I was trying to make waste smaller. Thomas looked genuinely conflicted. So was I. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Richard gestured toward the stock pot. We're wasting time. Denise sighed softly. She lifted the heavy pot again. Jordan suddenly stepped forward. I'll do it. He carried the soup toward the disposal sink. Barbara watched him. Every step felt heavier than the last. The steam rose one final time before disappearing forever. She turned away. Not because she couldn't bear to watch, because she respected the people making the decision even if she disagreed with it. After closing, snow had accumulated another 3 inches. Barbara zipped her coat and prepared to leave. Thomas called after her. Barbara. She turned. Walk with me. They stepped outside together. The street had become almost silent beneath fresh snow. For several blocks, neither spoke. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. Yeah, my mother hated wasting food. Barbara smiled. I figured. How? The shoes? Thomas laughed quietly. I suppose that's fair. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. When business was slow, he looked towards the snow-covered sidewalk. She'd quietly pay for meals herself. Barbara glanced at him. Really? Nobody knew. Not even me until years later. He smiled sadly. I found receipts after she died. They walked another block. Thomas stopped beneath a streetlight. The problem is, he searched for the right words. Restaurants survive on margins. Barbara nodded. I know. If we lose reputation, I know. If people misunderstand our intentions, I know. Thomas looked surprised. Barbara smiled gently. I understand your fear. He frowned. Do you? You think one wrong decision could cost dozens of employees their jobs? Thomas stared at her. Yes. And you're carrying responsibility for all of them. Yes, Barbara nodded. So your fear isn't greed. It's responsibility. Thomas looked down at the snow. No one's said that before. They usually call me stubborn. Barbara smiled. Sometimes responsibility wears the same face. They resumed walking. After another minute, Barbara spoke again. My fear looks different. Thomas listened. I worry about throwing away something another mother needed. Neither of them tried to convince the other. Both fears were real. At the next intersection, they stopped. Barbara's bus would arrive in 6 minutes. Thomas looked at the notebook still tucked beneath her arm. Don't stop writing. She looked surprised. You really mean that? I didn't say yes, I know, but don't stop thinking. The bus arrived. Barbara climbed aboard. As it pulled away, Thomas remained standing beneath the falling snow. His mother's words echoed somewhere deep inside him. A restaurant isn't only measured by the meals it sells. It's measured by the people who leave believing they still mattered. He couldn't remember exactly when she had said it, but suddenly he wished he had listened more carefully. The following afternoon, the restaurant was unusually busy. Near closing time, Jordan carried empty trays toward the kitchen entrance. As he pushed open the front door to take out recycling, he noticed a young woman standing across the street with 2 children. The younger boy pressed both hands against the restaurant window. The older girl stared at diners, finishing bowls of soup. The mother gently shook her head. They turned away. Jordan watched them disappear into the snow. Minutes later, he found Barbara organizing containers. There was a family outside. She looked up immediately. They didn't come in. No. They just looked. Barbara closed the refrigerator door slowly. Without saying a word, she picked up 2 untouched bread rolls that were about to be discarded under policy. She stopped halfway to the exit. Richard stood there. What are you doing? Barbara answered honestly. I was thinking. Richard glanced at the bread. You know the rules. And I do. She lowered the rolls back onto the counter. I wasn't trying to break them. I know. His answer surprised both of them. Richard looked at the bread for several seconds, then at Barbara, then toward the dark dining room. Finally, he said quietly, rules are easier than judgment. Barbara didn't answer, because she knew exactly what he meant. Just then, the front bell chimed. The last customer of the evening walked in. Behind him, brushing snow from his shoulders, came Samuel Reed. He wasn't looking for charity. He walked directly to the counter and placed 5 carefully folded $20 bills on the register. Jordan blinked. Samuel, the older man smiled. I found 2 days of work repairing a warehouse heating system. He looked toward Barbara. I came to pay for the sandwich. Barbara immediately shook her head. You don't owe me anything. Samuel gently pushed the money back across the counter. No. I owe the next person. The kitchen fell silent. Samuel continued, "I don't want the sandwich. I want you to use this so someone else can eat when they need it." Barbara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the folded bills. Neither spoke. But somewhere inside the quiet kitchen, the first real piece of Barbara's notebook had just come to life. No one reached for the money. The 5 $20 bills remained on the counter between Samuel Reed and Thomas Bennett, like a question no one knew how to answer. Jordan looked from one man to the other. Richard folded his arms. Barbara stood perfectly still. Samuel smiled awkwardly. "I didn't come to make things uncomfortable." Thomas finally spoke. "You said you wanted someone else to eat." Samuel nodded. "I've spent enough years pretending I'll pay kindness back someday." He glanced toward Barbara. "The truth is, you can't." Barbara opened her mouth to object, but Samuel gently shook his head. "You can only pass it forward." Silence settled over the restaurant. Outside, snow drifted lazily beneath the streetlights. Inside, the last customers quietly finished their meals, unaware that a conversation near the register was about to reshape the future of the restaurant. Thomas slowly picked up the folded bills. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "The next person who walks in hungry. Feed them. They don't have to know my name. They don't have to thank me. They don't even have to know somebody already paid." Thomas looked down at the money again. Richard spoke first. "That sounds simple." "It isn't." Everyone turned toward him. Richard continued in his practical tone. "How do we decide who's hungry enough? What if people abuse it? What if word spreads? What if 20 people show up tomorrow expecting free meals?" Samuel nodded. "Those are fair questions." Barbara quietly added, "And they're exactly why dignity matters." Richard looked at her. "What does dignity have to do with accounting?" "Everything." She stepped closer to the counter. "If someone has to stand here explaining why they're poor..." She paused. "They've already paid more than the meal is worth." Jordan frowned thoughtfully. "So, how do we know?" Barbara smiled gently. "We don't." Richard looked unconvinced. "So, we just trust everyone." Barbara met his eyes. "We trust our staff." Thomas watched her carefully. She wasn't arguing emotionally. She was building a system. The decision shouldn't belong to the customer. Barbara continued. "It should belong to the people who work here. If someone quietly asks whether a meal has already been paid for..." She looked around the room. "The answer can simply be yes. No forms, no speeches, no photographs, no questions." Thomas leaned against the counter. "And the money?" Barbara glanced at Samuel. "It stays here. In plain accounting, every dollar recorded, every meal counted." Richard immediately asked, "How?" Barbara reached into her backpack and removed the notebook. She flipped several pages before placing it on the counter. "I kept thinking about that." Thomas recognized the page. At the top, written in a careful handwriting, were the words "Prepaid Meal Ledger." Beneath it were simple columns: date, amount received, number of meals available, number of meals claimed, balance remaining. Nothing complicated, nothing hidden. Richard examined the page. "It's transparent." Barbara nodded. "It has to be." Thomas looked at Samuel. "You inspired this without realizing it." Samuel smiled. "I just wanted to repay half a sandwich." Barbara laughed softly. "It was only half." Samuel shook his head. "No, it was hope." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Thomas folded the notebook shut. "We'll test it." Richard looked up immediately. "Thomas, a trial. Nothing permanent." Richard sighed. "And if people take advantage," Thomas answered calmly, "then we'll adjust." If it works, he looked toward Barbara, then perhaps we've learned something. Barbara wasn't smiling. She looked relieved, not because her idea had been accepted, because it would finally exist outside the pages of her notebook. The following Monday, the program quietly began. There were no posters, no newspaper announcements, no social media campaign. Thomas insisted on that. If we're doing this, he said, we're not turning generosity into advertising. Barbara agreed immediately. Instead of signs in the dining room, Jordan carved small wooden tokens from leftover maple blocks that had once been part of damaged serving trays. Each token was about the size of a silver dollar. Barbara sanded every edge smooth after work. Sophia helped one evening at the apartment kitchen table. She carefully drew a tiny outline of a shoe on each wooden circle using a pencil. Barbara traced the drawings with a wood-burning pen borrowed from Helen Brooks. On the back of every token, Sophia carefully wrote 4 words. Shoes remember every road. Her handwriting was uneven. Some letters leaned sideways. Barbara refused to correct them. They're perfect, she said. They look homemade. They are. The first token sat beside the register on Tuesday morning. A customer named Mr. Harold Simmons noticed it while paying for breakfast. What's this? Jordan glanced toward Barbara. She nodded. Jordan explained quietly. If you'd ever like to pay for an extra bowl of soup? He hesitated. Someone who needs it can ask whether there's already one waiting. Mr. Simmons looked at the wooden token. No names. No names. No photographs. No. No tax receipt. Jordan smiled. Just soup. The older man reached into his wallet. I'll take 2. Jordan carefully placed 2 additional wooden shoes into a glass jar beside the register. No applause followed. No announcement. Breakfast continued as normal. Barbara smiled to herself while chopping celery, exactly as she had hoped. 3 days passed. No one claimed a prepaid meal. Richard quietly mentioned it. Maybe nobody needs it. Barbara looked toward the window. They do. They just don't know it's there yet. Friday afternoon arrived with another burst of heavy snow. Business slowed early. Jordan was cleaning menus near the entrance when the front door opened. A teenage boy stepped inside, maybe 16, thin, wearing a jacket several sizes too large. Snow clung to his sleeves. He stood near the entrance for nearly a minute pretending to study the menu. Barbara recognized the hesitation immediately. She had worn that same expression herself more than once. Jordan approached. Can I help you? The boy cleared his throat. His voice nearly disappeared. I was wondering. He looked around to make sure no one else was listening. If anybody ever... He swallowed hard. Already paid. Jordan smiled. Yes. The boy blinked. Really? Jordan reached beneath the register, picked up one wooden token, turned it over, and then quietly placed it beside the order pad. Looks like someone already did. The teenager stared at the token. His eyes became glassy. You don't need anything. What soup do you like? The boy laughed nervously. I've never been here. Then today's a good day to start. Barbara watched from the kitchen window without interrupting. The teenager chose tomato basil and warm bread. He carried the tray to the corner table. He ate slowly, carefully, as though afraid the meal might disappear if he finished too quickly. Nobody stared, nobody whispered, nobody asked questions. When he finished, he quietly wiped the table himself before walking toward the door. As he passed the register, he stopped. I don't know who, Jordan smiled. You don't have to. The boy nodded. Then he looked at the wooden token one last time. I'll come back. When I can pay for someone else. Jordan grinned. We'll save you a token." The door closed behind him. Snow swirled briefly before the wind carried him out of sight. Richard had watched the entire exchange from across the dining room. He slowly walked toward Barbara. "I expected something different." She looked up. "What?" "I expected people to—" He searched for the right word. "Act as I jet entitled." Barbara smiled faintly. "What did you see instead?" Richard looked toward the empty table. "I saw someone trying very hard not to cry." Barbara returned to slicing vegetables. Hunger usually doesn't look the way people imagine. Richard stood there for another moment before quietly returning to the office. Later that evening, after closing, Thomas counted the ledger. 7 prepaid meals had been purchased. 1 had been used, 6 remained. He closed the notebook slowly. The numbers were small, financially almost meaningless, yet somehow they felt larger than many of the restaurant's busiest nights. As he turned off the dining room lights, his phone buzzed with a notification. A local neighborhood blog had posted a photograph taken through the restaurant window. The headline read, "Is Bennett's Table using poor families as a marketing stunt?" Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The article contained guesses, assumptions, and blurry photos of the wooden tokens near the register. The comments were already multiplying. Some praised the idea. Others accused the restaurant of exploiting vulnerable people. Thomas looked toward the dark kitchen where Barbara was still washing her station before going home. She had fought so hard to build something rooted in dignity. Now, before it had even found its footing, strangers who knew nothing about it were deciding what it meant. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Tomorrow, they would have to decide whether to defend the program or abandon it before misunderstanding destroyed everything they had begun. Thomas Bennett barely slept that night. The neighborhood blog post had been shared hundreds of times before midnight. By dawn, comments had multiplied into arguments. Some praised Bennett's Table for trying something different. Others accused the restaurant of turning struggling families into a branding opportunity. The most painful part was that none of the photographs actually showed anyone receiving a meal. They showed only the small wooden tokens beside the register. People had invented the rest. At 5:55 the next morning, Thomas was already sitting in his office with a cup of untouched coffee when Richard knocked. "You've seen it?" Thomas nodded. Richard placed several printed pages on the desk. "Reservations are already being canceled." Thomas looked down. 3 cancellations. Then 5. Then another 2. One customer had written, "I don't support businesses that exploit poverty for publicity." Thomas rubbed his forehead. We never announced anything." "I know. We never invited reporters." "I know." Richard folded his arms. "But perception becomes reality faster than facts." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard said the words Thomas had expected. "We should end the program." Thomas didn't answer. A few minutes later, Barbara arrived through the back entrance. She immediately sensed something was different. The kitchen was unusually quiet. Jordan wasn't joking while unloading vegetables. Denise wasn't humming as she sharpened knives. Even Richard seemed more tired than irritated. Barbara set down her backpack. "What happened?" Jordan hesitated. "You haven't seen the internet yet?" Barbara shook her head. "I left before Sophia woke up." Jordan silently handed her his phone. She read the headline, then another, then several comments beneath it. One read, "They probably photograph homeless people after giving them soup." Another claimed restaurants only do this for tax write-offs. Another simply said, "Fake kindness." Barbara slowly handed the phone back. She didn't look angry. She looked disappointed. Not because strangers misunderstood her, because strangers had decided the truth without ever asking. Thomas stepped into the kitchen. "Can we talk?" She nodded. They walked into the office together. Thomas closed the door. "I'm sorry." Barbara looked surprised. "For what?" "This." He gestured toward the phone lying on his desk. "I should have anticipated it." Barbara sat quietly. "And I should have protected the program better." She thought for a moment before speaking. "You can't protect people from imagining things." Thomas sighed. "No, but I can protect my employees." He leaned forward. "I'm considering ending it." Barbara looked at him calmly. "If that's what you believe is best for the restaurant—" He interrupted. "That's not what I asked." She waited. "What do you believe?" Barbara took a long breath. "I think ending it because people misunderstood it teaches the wrong lesson." Thomas remained silent. She continued, "If we stop now, everyone who bought a meal believing in the idea will think kindness only survives until criticism arrives." Thomas looked toward the window. "And if the restaurant starts losing money, then we fix the business, not the values." The sentence stayed in the room long after Barbara stopped speaking. A knock interrupted them. Richard stepped inside. "We've got another problem." "What now?" "The oven." They hurried into the kitchen. One of the large commercial convection ovens had shut itself off. An acrid electrical smell lingered in the air. Denise frowned. It tripped again. Jordan pressed the control panel. Nothing. Richard called maintenance immediately. 45 minutes later, the technician arrived. He spent nearly an hour inspecting wiring beneath the unit. Finally, he removed his gloves. "I wouldn't use this." Thomas frowned. "Can it be repaired today?" The technician slowly shook his head. "The heating element isn't the issue." "What is?" He pointed toward the rear gas assembly. "This system should have been replaced years ago." Thomas felt his stomach sink. "How much?" The technician hesitated. "I'd rather inspect the rest before giving a number." Within another hour, the inspection expanded. The main oven, the secondary range, the exhaust controls, the aging gas regulators. Every new discovery looked worse than the previous one. Finally, the technician gathered everyone. "I'll be honest." Thomas nodded. "I'd rather hear it honestly. The kitchen is safe today because we shut this down. But you're one equipment failure away from a serious fire." Silence filled the room. Denise slowly looked around the kitchen she had worked in for nearly 12 years. Jordan whispered, "You're serious." "I am." Richard crossed his arms. "What has to happen?" "The restaurant needs to close." "For how long?" "At least 3 days." Thomas almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because he genuinely didn't know how 3 days without business could be possible. Payroll, rent, loan payments, suppliers, insurance, everything continued whether customers walked through the door or not. 3 days, felt enormous. Jordan spoke first. "So, we're not working." Nobody answered. Barbara watched every face in the kitchen. Jordan's excitement about culinary school, Denise's quiet confidence, the dishwasher who had just started paying off medical debt, the prep cook supporting elderly parents. 3 days without wages mattered. Maybe not to everyone equally, but to many of them it mattered desperately. Thomas thanked the technician and walked back into his office alone. He closed the door. For several minutes he simply stared at the framed photograph of Eleanor Bennett. "You always knew what to do." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't." A gentle knock interrupted him. "Barbara, you asked if I believed in the program." Thomas nodded. "I did. I believe in something else, too." She stepped inside carrying her notebook. "I've been thinking." Thomas smiled faintly. "You usually have." Barbara opened to a blank page. What if we don't stop cooking? Thomas looked confused. We have to. We have to stop cooking here, she pointed at the floor, but not everywhere. Thomas frowned. What are you suggesting? The Northside Community Center. He searched his memory. They have a certified commercial kitchen. Barbara nodded. They rent it by the day. Thomas's expression changed slightly. We could prepare a limited menu. Soup, fresh bread, 3 sandwiches, no fried food, no grill. Simple. Thomas slowly leaned forward. Barbara continued writing while she spoke. We already know our best-selling items. We reduce the menu. We reduce waste. We keep staff working. We keep serving customers. Thomas interrupted. Transportation. I've already thought about it. She turned another page. Jordan's pickup truck for dry goods. Rental insulated containers. Volunteer delivery between locations until the restaurant reopens. Thomas stared at the notebook. You planned this? I started while waiting for the bus last night. He almost smiled. You plan quickly. Barbara shook her head. I plan because I know what unemployment feels like. Another page, labor schedule, reduced but fair. Every employee keeps at least part of their hours. Nobody loses all their income. Thomas read silently. Projected costs, rental fees, temporary permits, packaging, expected revenue, break-even point. Every figure carefully handwritten. He looked up. You calculated all this overnight, Barbara smiled. I couldn't sleep. Thomas closed the notebook. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he stood. Come with me. They walked back into the kitchen where everyone waited anxiously. Thomas looked around the room. I have bad news. Every face tightened. The restaurant will close temporarily. Jordan lowered his eyes. Denise exhaled quietly. Richard already knew. Thomas continued. But several heads lifted. Barbara has given me another option. He held up the notebook. We're moving the kitchen. Jordan blinked. What? Thomas smiled for the first time all day. Not permanently. Temporarily. The Northside Community Center. We'll operate a reduced menu until repairs are complete. Richard immediately began calculating. The permits. I'll handle them. The suppliers. I'll call them. The menu, Barbara quietly answered. I've already written it. Jordan laughed in disbelief. You really planned everything. Barbara shrugged modestly. I hoped we'd never need it. Denise folded her arms before breaking into a genuine smile. I've always wanted to cook somewhere with windows. The tension in the room eased, not completely, but enough. Thomas looked toward Barbara. She wasn't celebrating. She was already making lists, checking inventory, reassigning prep work, finding solutions. He suddenly understood something his mother had once tried to teach him. Leadership wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it was simply the calmest one when everyone else was afraid. As the staff gathered around the prep table to reorganize the next 3 days, none of them noticed Samuel Reed standing quietly outside the back door. He had come to thank Barbara again. Instead, after overhearing the technician mention the failing gas system, he looked thoughtfully toward the old exhaust vents above the kitchen roof. A memory returned to him. One he hadn't considered in years, because before homelessness, before grief, before losing everything, Samuel Reed had spent nearly 3 decades repairing commercial kitchen equipment, and for the first time since walking into Bennett's table, he realized he might have something far more valuable than money to give. At 6:15 the next morning, Bennett's table looked nothing like a restaurant preparing for breakfast service. The dining room chairs remained upside down on the tables. Plastic barriers blocked the kitchen entrance. Yellow inspection tags hung from the old gas line. Outside, a handwritten notice on the front door explained that the restaurant was temporarily closed for equipment repairs. Several regular customers stopped to read it before quietly walking away. Inside, however, nobody was standing still. Boxes filled with canned tomatoes, onions, flour, spices, disposable containers, and cleaning supplies lined the hallway. Jordan pushed a hand truck loaded with stock pots toward the delivery van. Denise checked ingredient lists one final time. Richard stood beside the inventory sheets, crossing off every item as it left the building. Thomas watched everything unfold. 3 days earlier, he would never have believed the restaurant could be dismantled and relocated in less than 24 hours. Barbara had somehow turned panic into a checklist. She walked through the kitchen with a clipboard, speaking calmly but never loudly. Jordan, don't forget the thermometer kit. Denise, the immersion blender goes with the soup station. Richard, dry storage labels are in the second box. Nobody questioned her directions. Not because she outranked them, because every instruction made sense. Thomas quietly smiled. Leadership, he realized, often appeared long before someone officially received the title. By 7:40, the convoy reached the North Side Community Center. The building was old but clean. Its commercial kitchen had once been used for culinary classes before funding cuts reduced the program. Mrs. Linda Morrison, the center director, greeted everyone with a broad smile. "We're glad you're here." Thomas shook her hand. "Thank you for helping us." She laughed. "Barbara already thanked me twice yesterday." Thomas looked toward Barbara. "You called before asking me." Barbara looked slightly embarrassed. "I wanted to know if the kitchen was available before bringing you another impossible idea." Linda smiled. She also asked about sanitation permits, loading docks, food storage capacity, emergency exits, and insurance. Jordan whispered to Denise, "Does she ever stop planning?" Denise grinned. "I hope not." The kitchen was smaller than Bennett's table. Only 6 people could comfortably work inside at once. Barbara immediately adjusted the workflow. "Soup stays here. Cold prep on the left. Bread station near the ovens. Packaging by the back door." Richard looked over the layout. "You've already measured the counters." Barbara nodded. "Yesterday afternoon." Thomas blinked. "You came here after work?" "I wanted to be sure it would actually work." Thomas laughed quietly. "I should have known." Within an hour, the first pots of soup were simmering. The familiar aroma of roasted tomatoes filled the room. Jordan looked around. "It actually feels." He searched for the word. "Peaceful." Denise nodded. "No dining room noise. No ticket printer screaming." Barbara smiled. "We'll still have plenty to do." As if on cue, the first delivery order appeared. Then another. Then 3 more. Local office workers who had seen the temporary closure online discovered that Bennett's Table was offering a limited pickup menu through the community center. By lunchtime, the operation was running surprisingly smoothly. Not perfectly, but smoothly enough. Barbara kept moving from station to station, checking temperatures, adjusting recipes, answering questions, replacing gloves, helping wash dishes when the sink backed up. Nobody had assigned those responsibilities. She simply filled whichever gap appeared first. Thomas noticed something else. She never gave an order she wasn't willing to do herself. When boxes needed lifting, she lifted them. When floors needed mopping, she grabbed the mop. When someone fell behind, she quietly stepped beside them instead of criticizing from across the room. Late that afternoon, Samuel Reed appeared carrying a worn leather toolbox. Jordan recognized him immediately. "Samuel." The older man smiled. "I heard you moved." Thomas walked over. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know." Samuel looked toward the temporary kitchen. "I also heard about the gas system." Thomas sighed. "It's worse than we thought." Samuel nodded slowly. I've spent 28 years repairing commercial kitchens. Richard looked surprised. I thought. Samuel smiled sadly. You thought I was just homeless. Richard looked uncomfortable. Samuel gently waved away the apology. Most people do. He opened the toolbox. I don't have my old company anymore, but I still know equipment. Thomas folded his arms. The inspectors already came. I know. I'm not here to argue with them. Samuel reached into the toolbox and removed several folded diagrams. I worked on this building 12 years ago. Thomas looked down. The diagram showed the original gas layout of Bennett's table. You kept these. Samuel laughed. I forget birthdays. I never forget kitchens. Together, they spread the drawings across a stainless steel table. Samuel pointed toward several markings. The inspectors are right. The system needs replacement. Thomas nodded. We already knew that. Samuel continued tracing the lines, but everyone leaned closer. I think you're replacing more than you actually have to. Richard frowned. What do you mean? This section. Samuel tapped the blueprint. It was upgraded after the 2014 remodel. Thomas looked confused. I barely remember that project. You hired a subcontractor? I supervised the installation. Samuel looked up. I know exactly which parts were replaced. Thomas called the repair contractor immediately. Within 2 hours, another inspection confirmed Samuel's memory. Nearly 40% of the quoted replacement work wasn't necessary. The revised estimate dropped dramatically. Thomas stared at the new numbers. He looked at Samuel. Almost $60,000 less. Samuel shrugged. Sometimes memory is worth more than money. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. You just saved this restaurant. Samuel smiled quietly. No. He looked toward Barbara, who was stirring soup while laughing with Jordan about something Sophia had drawn. I think she started saving it before I showed up. Thomas followed his gaze. Barbara had flour on one sleeve. Her hair had escaped its ponytail. She looked exhausted and happier than he had ever seen her. Not because life had become easy, because she finally had room to use what she had always been capable of. That evening, after cleanup, Barbara sat alone at one of the folding tables, completing payroll hours. She double-checked every employee's schedule. Jordan had gained 4 extra hours. Denise had lost none. Even the dishwasher kept enough shifts to avoid falling behind on rent. Barbara smiled with quiet satisfaction. Nobody would become rich this week. But nobody would be left completely without work either. Thomas approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. I guessed you still wouldn't buy yourself one. Barbara laughed. You guessed right. He placed 1 cup beside her. No deduction from your paycheck. She smiled. I appreciate that. For several moments, they simply drank in comfortable silence. Finally, Thomas spoke. I was thinking about offering to pay your remaining rent. Barbara looked at him. I know. He seemed surprised. You do. You've looked like someone rehearsing the sentence all day. Thomas laughed. I guess I'm not subtle. Barbara wrapped both hands around the warm cup. I need something different. I thought you might say that. If I accept money... She looked toward the busy kitchen where Jordan and Denise were still cleaning. Nothing changes except 1 bill. Thomas listened carefully. I need to build something that keeps working after the emergency passes. What does that look like? Barbara closed her notebook. Let me build the community meal program properly. Not as charity. As a permanent part of the business. Thomas remained silent. She continued, give it a budget. Give it measurable goals. Make it accountable. If it exceeds the restaurant benefits, If it fails, close it. Thomas considered every word. You'd run it. Barbara nodded. I'd earn it. Not receive it. Earn it. The distinction mattered. Thomas could hear it in every syllable. Before he could answer, Richard entered carrying several envelopes. The bank confirmed tomorrow's meeting. Thomas looked up. So, it's official. Richard nodded. They'll decide whether Bennett's Table qualifies for the restructuring loan. Thomas slowly exhaled. The future of the restaurant now depended on convincing lenders that this temporary kitchen, this struggling business, and Barbara's ideas represented a sound investment. Barbara quietly closed her notebook. She had no idea that tomorrow she wouldn't just be defending a restaurant. She would be defending her own future. Barbara Garcia arrived at the community center 40 minutes earlier than usual. Not because she wanted extra time to prepare soup, because she wanted a few quiet minutes before the meeting that could determine whether Bennett's Table survived the year. The bank representatives were scheduled to arrive at 10. Thomas had spent the previous evening reviewing financial statements. Richard had organized payroll records, invoices, and repair estimates. Barbara had reviewed a different set of papers. Temperature logs, food waste reports, daily sales, customer feedback, volunteer hours, the prepaid meal ledger. She placed every document into a blue binder, arranging them in the exact order she expected questions to come. Jordan watched her from across the kitchen. You look like you're studying for an exam. Barbara smiled without looking up. In a way, I am. You nervous? A little. You don't seem nervous. Barbara finally looked at him. My father used to tell me something. What? He said, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding fear doesn't get the final vote. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. I like that. Before Barbara could answer, Thomas entered, carrying a garment bag. I brought something. He unzipped it, revealing a navy blazer. Barbara frowned. I don't own anything formal anymore. I noticed. I can't accept that. Thomas expected the response. You aren't. Barbara folded her arms. I mean it. I know. He handed her a receipt. I rented it. She blinked. You can reimburse the restaurant over the next 6 paychecks if you'd like. Barbara looked from the receipt to the blazer. Then she laughed. You've learned. Thomas smiled. I'm trying. Half an hour later, the meeting room at the community center had been rearranged. A folding table held coffee water and neatly organized folders. Through the windows, fresh snow reflected bright winter sunlight across the parking lot. 3 people from the bank arrived together. A senior loan officer named Diane Foster, financial analyst Mark Holloway, regional risk manager Elaine Brooks. None of them looked particularly impressed by the temporary kitchen. Thomas greeted them warmly. Richard distributed financial packets. Barbara quietly remained near the end of the table until Thomas spoke. I'd like you to meet Barbara Garcia, our kitchen operations coordinator. Barbara looked at him. Operations coordinator, it wasn't officially her title. Thomas simply nodded, as though it had always been true. The meeting began with numbers. Revenue decline, repair costs, outstanding loans, insurance adjustments. Diane Foster listened carefully while making notes. Finally, she looked toward Barbara. Mr. Bennett mentioned you've been responsible for several operational improvements. Barbara nodded. I've helped. What exactly have you changed? Barbara opened the blue binder. She didn't begin with emotions. She began with data. Our average food waste over the previous quarter was 18.2%. She slid one report forward. During the last 8 operating days, including our temporary kitchen, it's averaged 10.6. Mark Holloway adjusted his glasses. How? We simplified prep. Reduced unnecessary menu variation. Improved inventory rotation. Repurposed ingredients before quality declined. She turned another page. Nothing served outside food safety standards. Elaine looked interested. So you reduced waste without reducing quality? Barbara nodded. That was the goal. Diane asked another question. What about labor? Barbara produced another chart. We reorganized station assignments based on workflow instead of job titles. Jordan, for example, spent less time waiting for instructions and more time completing preparation independently. Denise handled recipe consistency. Richard focused on purchasing. Everyone stayed within their strength. Thomas watched silently. She wasn't selling herself. She was explaining systems. Mark leaned forward. Mr. Bennett also mentioned a prepaid meal program. Richard shifted slightly. He knew this topic could become controversial. Barbara calmly placed the wooden token on the table. No customer is photographed. No recipient is identified. No names are recorded. The accounting is fully transparent. She opened the ledger. Every donation, every redeemed meal, every remaining balance, nothing hidden. Elaine studied the pages. This isn't charity accounting. Barbara shook her head. It's inventory. Diane smiled slightly. Interesting answer. Barbara continued. A meal already paid for is no different than any other product waiting to be served. The difference is only who purchased it. Mark looked thoughtful. And customers responded well. Thomas answered this time. Better than expected. Richard added quietly, The bookkeeping has been easier than I predicted. Barbara glanced at him with mild surprise. It was the closest thing to a compliment Richard had offered. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Then Diane closed her folder. I have one concern. The room grew still. She looked directly at Barbara. Your employment record. Barbara had expected this. Thomas started to speak. Barbara gently raised one hand. I'll answer. She folded her hands on the table. 3 years ago, I resigned from another restaurant. The paperwork says financial misconduct. It does. Were the accusations true? No. What evidence do you have? Barbara quietly reached into her binder. Not for a letter, not for a speech, for silence. Because before she could place anything on the table, the meeting room door opened unexpectedly. Everyone turned. A woman in her late 30s stepped inside, still wearing a winter coat dusted with snow. She looked nervous. I'm sorry. I know I'm interrupting. Thomas frowned politely. Can we help you? The woman looked directly at Barbara. My name is Emily Carter. Barbara froze. For a second, she couldn't speak. Emily offered a weak smile. It's been a long time. Richard looked confused. You know each other. Barbara slowly nodded. We worked together. Emily looked at the bank representatives. I was asked to wait until your meeting ended. She swallowed. But after hearing the question, she looked back at Barbara. I couldn't stay outside. Thomas pulled out a chair. Please. Emily sat carefully. Her hands trembled as she opened a large envelope. I worked at Riverside Grill. She removed photocopies of schedules, cash reports, email printouts. I kept these. Mark examined the documents. What are they? Emily answered. The truth. She explained that their former manager had altered cash records after closing. Refunds were entered for customers who had never requested them. Tip amounts had been changed, deposits reduced. Barbara had discovered inconsistencies first. Instead of investigating honestly, management blamed the employee least able to fight back. Emily lowered her eyes. I knew. The room remained silent. I knew Barbara was innocent. Her voice cracked. But my son had leukemia. I needed the insurance. I told myself I'd speak later. I never did. Barbara watched her quietly. No anger crossed her face. Only sadness. Emily slid one final document across the table. I found this after I finally left. It was an internal email. The manager had written, "Barbara is asking too many questions. Easier to let her go before ownership gets involved." The date matched exactly. Diane Foster read the message twice. Mark slowly removed his glasses. Richard stared without speaking. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Not because he was shocked, because Barbara had told the truth from the beginning. Emily looked toward Barbara. "I'm sorry. I should have come years ago," Barbara answered softly. "You were protecting your son. I was protecting myself." "So was I." Emily shook her head. "I let you carry it alone." Barbara reached across the table. She placed her hand gently over Emily's. "We both survived. Let's make sure somebody else doesn't have to. No accusation, no bitterness, only grace." The room felt different after that. Not lighter, clearer. Diane carefully closed the employment file. "I appreciate your honesty." She looked at Barbara. "You could have hidden this." Barbara shook her head. "If someone has to discover the truth later, trust disappears. I'd rather lose an opportunity than build one on a lie." Thomas looked at her with quiet admiration. He realized something profound. Barbara had spent years paying the price for a false accusation. Yet she still refused to build her future by pretending it never happened. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The bank representatives gathered their folders. Before leaving, Diane paused beside Thomas. "We'll still review the financials," she glanced toward Barbara. "But leadership isn't listed on a balance sheet. Perhaps it should be." After they left, the room remained silent. Emily stood. "I don't expect forgiveness." Barbara smiled gently. "I already gave it before you walked through the door." Emily began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for years of guilt to finally leave her shoulders. As Barbara helped gather the papers from the table, Thomas looked out the window at the snow-covered parking lot. For the first time in months, he believed the future of Bennett's Table might not depend solely on repairing ovens or balancing accounts. It might depend on the kind of people willing to stand beside one another when telling the truth carried a cost. 3 weeks later, the lights inside Bennett's Table came on before sunrise for the first time since the kitchen had closed for repairs. Fresh stainless steel gas lines gleamed beneath the new ranges. The aging convection oven had been replaced with 2 energy-efficient units. The ventilation system no longer rattled whenever someone turned it on. Even the familiar smell of the building had changed. Instead of old grease trapped inside worn ductwork, the kitchen carried the clean scent of polished steel-fresh paint and warm bread rising in the proofing cabinet. Jordan stood in the middle of the room, turning slowly in a circle. "It feels like somebody rebuilt the place while we were sleeping." Denise laughed. "They practically did." Richard walked through the kitchen carrying a clipboard. He stopped near the new prep stations and looked toward Barbara. "You were right." Barbara looked up from arranging herbs. "About what?" "We should have reorganized the kitchen years ago." She smiled. "It's easier to move people than walls." Richard actually laughed. No one in the room missed it. Jordan raised an eyebrow toward Denise. Did Richard just laugh? I think so. "Should we write down the date?" Richard heard them. "Keep talking and I'll make both of you clean the walk-in." Jordan grinned. "That's more like the Richard we know." The teasing was gentle, comfortable. Something had shifted during the weeks they spent working together at the community center. People had stopped protecting their own stations and started protecting one another. Thomas entered carrying a small wooden box. Everyone gathered instinctively. "I've got news." Jordan whispered dramatically. "Good news." Thomas smiled. "For once." He looked around the room. The bank approved the restructuring loan. A cheer broke out almost immediately. Jordan hugged Denise before realizing what he had done. She laughed and hugged him back. Richard simply closed his eyes for a brief second and exhaled. Barbara smiled quietly. Thomas continued. They also approved funding for a permanent community kitchen partnership. Everyone looked toward Barbara. Thomas nodded. That part happened because of her. Barbara immediately shook her head. It happened because everybody kept working. Thomas smiled. And because somebody kept writing ideas in a notebook. He opened the wooden box. Inside lay several carved maple tokens shaped like tiny shoes. Not the round wooden discs Sophia had made. These were more carefully crafted. Each one had a small hole drilled through the top. I had these made. Barbara picked one up. On the front was the outline of a simple work shoe. On the back, burned neatly into the wood, were the words, "Shoes remember every road." Thomas looked around the room. These aren't for customers. They're for us. Jordan frowned. What do they mean? Thomas answered slowly. They remind us that every person who walks through our doors has already traveled a road we know nothing about. Nobody spoke. Barbara gently turned the token over in her fingers. She thought of the 6-mile walk, of Samuel, of Emily, of Sophia kneeling on the apartment floor with red thread. One simple sentence had somehow gathered all of them together. By the following Monday, Bennett's table officially reopened. Customers returned cautiously at first. Many had followed updates online about the repairs. Some came because they had missed the restaurant. Others came because they were curious about the story that had quietly spread through the neighborhood. The prepaid meal program remained. Only now it had a new name. Open Table Kitchen. Not because it belonged only to Bennett's table, but because the goal had grown larger than one dining room. The community center kitchen would remain active 3 afternoons each week. Restaurant staff rotated through it on paid shifts. Students from a nearby vocational program volunteered alongside experienced cooks. Every participant learned food safety inventory management, basic knife skills, and customer service. Nobody worked for free. Thomas insisted on that. If somebody creates value, he said during the first orientation, they deserve to be paid. Barbara added one sentence. And if somebody is still learning, they deserve to be taught. Jordan quickly became the unofficial mentor for new trainees. He remembered exactly how overwhelming the kitchen had once felt. Instead of correcting mistakes by shouting, he demonstrated quietly. Barbara noticed the change. You've become patient. Jordan laughed. I learned from watching you. You learned because you wanted to. Maybe. But watching helped. Samuel also returned, not as a customer, as an employee. Thomas offered him a part-time position maintaining kitchen equipment for both the restaurant and the community center. The pay, wasn't extravagant. Samuel accepted immediately. I haven't had keys to a workplace in almost 4 years. He admitted, while looking at the small keyring Thomas handed him, I'd almost forgotten what they feel like. His first paycheck went toward renting a modest room in a boarding house only 6 blocks from the restaurant. The room contained little more than a bed, a desk, and one window overlooking an alley. Samuel considered it beautiful. One afternoon, Barbara found him sitting quietly after work. You all right? He smiled. I keep waking up expecting someone to tell me I don't belong there. Barbara understood. Does the feeling go away? Samuel thought for a long moment. I don't think so. I think we just stopped believing it. Barbara nodded. I hope you're right. Business steadily improved. The simplified menu developed during the temporary closure had unexpectedly become popular. Waste remained lower. Kitchen efficiency improved. Employee turnover dropped. Thomas reviewed the monthly reports with genuine disbelief. "We're making fewer things," Richard nodded, "but making them better." Thomas smiled. "And throwing away less." Barbara looked at the charts. "And feeding more." The prepaid meal ledger continued growing slowly. Some weeks, only 3 meals were purchased. Other weeks, nearly 40. Nobody advertised it. Nobody posted videos. Customers simply noticed the small wooden shoe beside the register. Some quietly bought one, others didn't. Both choices were respected equally. One snowy Thursday afternoon, Sophia visited after school carrying a sketchbook, almost as large as her backpack. Jordan waved enthusiastically. "Artists here," she laughed. "I'm still practicing." Barbara looked up from the prep station. "What have you got?" Sophia spread several drawings across a table. One showed the restaurant. Another showed the community center. The last showed dozens of different pairs of shoes. Work boots, nursing shoes, construction boots, sneakers, dress shoes, wheelchair wheels beside children's boots. Above them she had written, "Every road looks different." Everyone gathered around. Denise wiped a tear before pretending she had something in her eye. Jordan whispered, "That's going on a wall." Thomas looked at the drawing for a long time. "May I frame this?" Sophia looked toward her mother. Barbara smiled. "That's your decision." Sophia nodded shyly. "Okay." A week later, the framed drawing hung near the employee entrance instead of the dining room. Customers rarely saw it. Employees passed it every day, exactly where Barbara believed it belonged. Late one evening, Richard found Barbara reviewing training schedules. "I owe you an apology." She looked surprised. "For what?" "I spent weeks trying to prove you wouldn't last." Barbara smiled gently. "I noticed. I thought you wanted sympathy. And now—" Richard looked toward the framed drawing of different shoes. "I think you wanted standards. Just different ones." Barbara closed her notebook. "I wanted people measured by what they do after someone finally believes in them." Richard nodded slowly. "I've spent years measuring the wrong things." Before Barbara could answer, Thomas stepped into the office holding an envelope. It arrived this afternoon. He handed it to Barbara. The return address belonged to the City Culinary Workforce Partnership. Barbara opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. Open Table Kitchen had been selected for a statewide Workforce Innovation Grant. The funding would allow them to train unemployed parents, former service workers, and adults returning to the workforce after long absences. Barbara read the letter twice before looking up. "They chose us." Thomas smiled. "No, they chose what you've built." Barbara shook her head. "We built it." Thomas looked around the room. Jordan teaching knife skills. Samuel adjusting a new oven thermostat. Denise laughing with trainees. Richard reorganizing inventory without being asked. Sophia's drawing hanging quietly on the wall. He smiled. "You're right." Outside, snow began falling once more across Milwaukee. Inside Bennett's table, the roads that had brought so many different people together were beginning to lead somewhere none of them had imagined when a tired mother first walked through the back door, wearing a pair of worn shoes held together by 3 small stitches of red thread. By early December, Milwaukee had settled into another long winter. Snow gathered along the sidewalks before sunrise, coating parked cars and softening the sharp edges of the city. Inside Bennett's table, however, warmth arrived long before the first customers. Fresh bread baked in the ovens before 6. Soup simmered slowly in polished stock pots. Coffee filled the dining room with a familiar aroma that regular customers had come to associate with comfort rather than luxury. Barbara Garcia unlocked the employee entrance at 5:40 every morning. It had become a quiet ritual. She would switch on the kitchen lights, review the prep list, check the inventory, then stand for a few seconds beneath Sophia's framed drawing of different shoes. Every road looks different. She never walked past it without looking. Not because she needed motivation, because she needed perspective. No matter how organized the kitchen became, every new employee arrived carrying struggles invisible to everyone else. Some were rebuilding after layoffs. Some were escaping abusive relationships. Some were simply trying to begin again after years of believing nobody would hire them. Barbara had learned that resumes told only part of a person's story. The rest was written in roads no interviewer could see. One Tuesday afternoon, Thomas Bennett received a phone call from the assisted living residence where his mother, Eleanor Bennett, had spent the final months of her life. He frowned as he listened. "I understand. I'll come today." When he hung up, Barbara noticed the change in his expression. "Everything all right?" Thomas nodded slowly. "They found something that belonged to my mother. I thought we'd already collected everything." "So did I." He left shortly after lunch. The assisted living residence stood on the west side of the city, tucked between a small church and a neighborhood library. Most of the staff who remembered Eleanor had retired years earlier. Only the current administrator remained. She welcomed Thomas into a small office. "We've been reorganizing archived storage." She placed a worn brown envelope on the desk. It was inside a box labeled with your mother's name. Thomas carefully picked it up. Across the front, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For Thomas. Later." His throat tightened. He hadn't seen her handwriting in years. He thanked the administrator and sat alone in the chapel before opening the envelope. Inside was a folded recipe card, a faded photograph, and a handwritten letter. The recipe card contained the soup Eleanor had served on the restaurant's opening day decades earlier. Tomato roasted carrots, onions, celery herbs, and one unexpected ingredient, a small spoonful of apple butter. Thomas smiled through damp eyes. So that's why. He had spent years trying to recreate the flavor. He had never managed to. The photograph showed a much younger Eleanor standing outside the original Bennett's table beside a handmade wooden sign. Next to her stood a skinny 12-year-old boy wearing an oversized apron. Thomas himself. His mother rested one hand gently on his shoulder. Both of them were laughing. He couldn't remember why. Then he unfolded the letter. "My dear Tommy, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get another chance to tell you these things in person. Please don't feel guilty for becoming busy. Work matters, responsibility matters, providing for people matters. But don't ever confuse those things with seeing people. Restaurants are not built from recipes. They're built from moments when someone walks through the door carrying more than hunger. Sometimes they're carrying fear, sometimes grief, sometimes embarrassment, sometimes hope. Most people will never tell you which one. You'll have to notice. If you ever become successful enough that no one tells you the truth anymore, spend one day working beside the newest employee. Watch how they treat the dishwasher. Watch how they speak to the lonely customer. Watch whether they protect food or waste it. Those things will tell you more than any interview. Remember something else. I was never proud because we survived hard years. I was proud because we never allowed hard years to make us hard people." Love Mom Thomas read the final paragraph 3 times. By the time he returned to Bennett's table that evening, his eyes were red. Barbara was finishing inventory when she noticed him standing quietly near the employee entrance. "You were gone longer than expected." Thomas nodded. "I found my mother's last letter." Barbara set down the clipboard. "Was it difficult to read?" "Very." He handed her the recipe card. She finally revealed the missing ingredient. Barbara laughed softly. "Apple butter. I spent 15 years trying to figure it out." She looked at the handwritten measurements. "They're beautiful. They're messy. Barbara smiled. So are the best recipes. Thomas hesitated. I'd like you to read something. He handed her the letter. Barbara read it slowly. She stopped at one sentence. Restaurants are not built from recipes. They're built from moments when someone walks through the door carrying more than hunger. She looked up. I think she understood people remarkably well. Thomas nodded, better than I ever did. Barbara closed the letter carefully. I don't think she'd agree. You don't? No. Thomas looked surprised. Barbara continued quietly. If she saw you now, she glanced toward the community kitchen schedule hanging on the wall, she'd see someone still learning. Not someone who failed. Thomas looked down. I wasn't there enough during her last year. Barbara understood the weight behind those words. My father died before we made peace. Thomas looked up. I didn't know. There were things we never got to say. She smiled gently. I spent years wishing I could change the ending. Can you? No. What changed? I realized regret can either become a prison or a promise. Thomas listened carefully. I couldn't change how my father died, but I could change how I showed up for Sophia. Silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Thomas folded the letter again. I think my mother's asking the same thing. Not to keep looking backward. To live differently tomorrow. Barbara nodded. I think that's exactly what she meant. The following week, Bennett's table introduced a new seasonal soup. Eleanor's winter tomato. Nothing on the menu explained why it carried that name. There was no sentimental story printed beneath it. No framed tribute in the dining room. Only one quiet sentence at the bottom, made from a family recipe. Customers loved it almost immediately. Some noticed the subtle sweetness. Others simply said it tasted comforting. Thomas smiled every time someone ordered it, not because it increased sales, because it brought his mother back into the restaurant in the only way she would have wanted. Through the food, not the attention. A few days later, Barbara received an envelope of her own. Inside was the official agreement for the statewide workforce partnership grant. Along with it came another document, a proposed ownership pathway. If Open Table Kitchen continued meeting financial and training benchmarks over the next 3 years, Barbara would receive an equity stake in the program she had helped build. She read the proposal twice before carrying it into Thomas's office. I can't accept this as a gift, Thomas smiled. It isn't. It's earned. There are performance requirements, financial goals, annual reviews. If the program fails, the agreement ends. Barbara looked through every page carefully. She asked questions about legal language, about responsibilities, about liabilities. Thomas answered every one. Only after nearly 40 minutes did Barbara sign. Not because someone had rescued her, because she thought someone had finally offered her the chance to build something she could truly help own. That evening, Sophia waited excitedly at home. How did it go? Barbara knelt beside her daughter. We've got a lot more work to do, Sophia tilted her head. So, that's good. Barbara laughed. It's very good. Sophia hugged her tightly. I told you the shoes remembered. Barbara smiled as she looked toward the old shoebox resting on the highest shelf in the apartment closet. The worn black shoes were still there, their leather cracked, their soles worn thin. 3 uneven stitches of faded red thread still held the torn heel together. She realized she would probably never wear them again, but she also knew she would never throw them away, not because they reminded her of poverty, because they reminded her that the hardest roads of her life had also led her toward people she never would have met otherwise. Outside, another snowstorm quietly settled over Milwaukee. And somewhere beyond the restaurant windows, another traveler was already beginning a difficult journey that would soon cross Barbara Garcia's path. Exactly 1 year after Barbara Garcia had walked 6 miles through a blizzard, Milwaukee woke to another winter storm. Snow drifted across the streets in slow, quiet waves covering yesterday's footprints before sunrise. At 5:38 a.m., Barbara unlocked the employee entrance of Bennett's table, just as she had done hundreds of times over the past year. Some routines never changed. She switched on the kitchen lights. She checked the soup stock. She reviewed the day's prep schedule. Before stepping fully into the kitchen, she paused beneath Sophia's framed drawing. Every road looks different. Barbara smiled. It still does. The restaurant no longer felt like a place fighting to survive. It felt alive. Jordan now supervised morning prep for the training kitchen 2 days each week. Denise oversaw recipe development and food safety. Samuel maintained equipment for both Bennett's Table and Open Table Kitchen, proudly wearing a work shirt with his own embroidered name again. Richard, once known for measuring only punctuality and paperwork, had become unexpectedly patient with new trainees. The greatest change, however, wasn't found on any financial report. It was found in the people walking through the back door. Over the previous year, Open Table Kitchen had trained 34 adults. 28 had found full-time employment. 4 had started catering businesses of their own. 2 were still completing the program. Not everyone succeeded immediately, but everyone left with skills, references, and dignity intact. Barbara insisted that graduation ceremonies remain simple. No speeches, no dramatic testimonials. Each graduate received 3 things: a knife roll, a food safety certificate, and a small wooden shoe token with 4 familiar words burned into the back. Shoes remember every road. Just after 8 that morning, the front bell chimed. Richard looked up from the host stand. A young woman stood just inside the doorway. Snow clung to the shoulders of her thin coat. She held a soaked folder against her chest. Her boots were cracked along both sides. Behind tired eyes was the unmistakable expression Richard now recognized immediately. Someone trying very hard not to look desperate. She approached cautiously. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled slightly. "My interview was supposed to be at 8. She looked toward the clock. "It took me almost 3 hours." Richard glanced at the time. 8:24. A year earlier, he would have looked only at the clock. Now he looked at her boots, then at the snow melting beneath them, then at the folder she was gripping so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "What happened?" he asked. "The bus stopped running." "I walked after that." "How far?" She hesitated. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 5 miles. Richard nodded slowly. "What is your name?" "Rachel Thompson." He smiled gently. "Come inside." Rachel blinked. "I know I'm late." "I know. I understand if the position's gone." Richard shook his head. "First things first." He pointed toward a chair near the heater. "Sit down." She hesitated. "I don't want to make a mess. The floor can be mopped. You can't warm up standing outside." Rachel slowly sat. Jordan appeared carrying a clean towel. "Here." Denise walked over with a steaming mug. "Hot tea." Rachel looked overwhelmed. "I don't have money." Denise smiled. "I wasn't selling it." Barbara stepped out of the kitchen after hearing unfamiliar voices. For a brief moment, she simply stared. It felt as though she were looking at herself from 1 year earlier. The wet coat, the exhausted face, the careful way Rachel tried to hide her embarrassment. Barbara walked over calmly. "I'm Barbara." Rachel stood immediately. "I am so sorry I'm late." Barbara smiled. "So was I." Rachel looked confused. "What?" Barbara glanced toward Richard. He quietly nodded. "You've got time." Barbara looked back at Rachel. Would you like to warm up before we start? You'll still interview me, Barbara answered honestly. We'll still evaluate you. Rachel lowered her eyes. That's more than I expected. Barbara led her toward the employee break room. Inside was a small locker labeled Emergency Supplies. Barbara opened it. Several pairs of thick socks, gloves, scarves, basic toiletries. Jordan had started the locker months earlier after remembering Samuel's first winter back at work. Barbara handed Rachel a pair of warm socks. You can borrow these. Rachel looked embarrassed. I'll give them back. Barbara smiled. Keep them. I'll pay. No. Barbara interrupted gently. You can help the next person someday. Rachel slowly nodded. After changing into dry socks, Rachel joined Barbara in the kitchen. The interview looked nothing like traditional hiring. Barbara didn't ask where Rachel had failed before. She didn't ask why she was unemployed. She didn't ask about gaps in her resume. Instead, she placed an onion, a carrot, and a chef's knife on the cutting board. Show me how you hold the knife. Rachel's hands shook. Barbara noticed immediately. Take your time. Rachel adjusted her grip. Not perfectly, but safely. Good. Next came basic sanitation. Temperature questions. Simple recipe scaling. Rachel answered some correctly. Others she admitted she didn't know. I've never worked in a professional kitchen. Barbara appreciated the honesty. Finally, Barbara asked one question. Can you learn? Rachel looked surprised. I think so. Barbara smiled. Good. We can teach skills. We can't teach someone to care. The evaluation ended 40 minutes later. Jordan quietly reviewed the scoring sheet. So, Barbara nodded. She needs training. Rachel immediately looked disappointed. I'm sorry. Barbara frowned. For what? I thought I wasn't good enough. Barbara shook her head. You aren't ready. Those are different things. Rachel looked uncertain. Barbara continued. If you're willing to work, if you're willing to listen, if you're willing to improve, we have a paid training position beginning Monday. Rachel covered her mouth. You mean, I got it. You earned an opportunity. Tears filled Rachel's eyes. She quickly wiped them away. I promised myself I wouldn't cry. Barbara smiled softly. Nobody's grading that part. Later that afternoon, Sophia arrived after school carrying a wrapped shoebox. She looked around until she found Rachel cleaning prep tables with Jordan. Excuse me. Rachel turned. Yes. Sophia held out the box. My mom said you finished your first day. Rachel looked confused. I did. Then these are yours. Inside rested a brand new pair of black kitchen shoes. Rachel immediately shook her head. I can't take these. Sophia smiled. I saved for them. You did. I sold handmade greeting cards at school fairs. Rachel looked toward Barbara. I can't. Barbara simply said, Open the lid again. Tucked beneath the shoes was a folded note in Sophia's familiar handwriting. You don't owe us. Just remember someone else when your road gets easier. Rachel pressed the note against her chest. I don't know what to say. Sophia shrugged. My grandpa used to say, thank you is nice. But helping the next person lasts longer. Barbara looked at her daughter surprised. I don't remember saying that. You didn't. Sophia smiled. I made it up. Everyone laughed. As evening settled over Milwaukee, the dining room slowly emptied. One customer quietly purchased 2 prepaid meals. Another added 5. A college student bought one with the change from his pocket. No announcements followed. No applause. Only another wooden shoe dropped gently into the glass jar beside the register. Samuel adjusted a loose hinge near the kitchen door. Jordan demonstrated knife safety to 2 trainees. Denise tasted the evening soup before nodding with approval. Richard patiently explained inventory procedures to a nervous new employee who apologized 3 times for asking questions. Thomas stood near the dining room window watching snow fall outside. Barbara joined him. Busy day. The best kind. He looked toward the glass jar filled with wooden shoe tokens. My mother would have loved this. Barbara smiled. I think she already does. Thomas nodded quietly. So do I. When the restaurant finally closed, Barbara walked to the employee entrance. Before turning off the lights, she looked once more at Sophia's drawing. Every road looks different. Then she looked toward the small display case mounted beside it. Inside rested her old black work shoes. The leather was cracked. The soles were worn almost smooth. 3 faded red stitches still crossed the torn heel. A small brass plaque beneath them read, "These shoes did not change a life." The woman who refused to stop walking did. Barbara smiled gently. She switched off the lights. Outside, fresh snow continued covering the city. Inside, the warmth remained. Not because of the ovens, but because one act of quiet kindness had become another, and another, until an entire community learned that the greatest opportunities are not the ones we receive. They are the ones we choose to pass on. The roads would always be different, but no one had to walk them completely alone. Life has a quiet way of testing us long before it rewards us. Sometimes the hardest journey isn't measured in miles, but in the number of times we choose to keep moving after being told no. Barbara's story reminds us that dignity is never something another person can give us. It is something we carry with us even when our shoes are worn. Our pockets are nearly empty and the future feels uncertain. A single opportunity can change a life, but only if it is met with courage, integrity, and the willingness to work for something greater than ourselves. Kindness also has a remarkable way of traveling farther than we imagine. Barbara shared half of a sandwich, never expecting to see Samuel again. Sophia repaired a pair of old shoes without knowing they carried someone else's memories. Thomas chose to see the person behind the resume instead of the accusation written on paper. None of those moments seemed extraordinary on their own. Together, they created a future that no amount of money alone could have built. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share about someone who gave you a chance when you needed it most. Your story might encourage someone else who feels like giving up today. If you enjoyed this journey, please share it with someone you care about and subscribe for more stories that remind us how compassion, perseverance, and ordinary people can change the world, one small act of kindness at a time.